waved his arm, and the partisans urged their tired mounts into a gallop. The Spaniards rode back into the valley, scattering as they picked their own course, and the Lancers, a different regiment from the Poles, chose their targets and went for them with levelled blades and spurts of bright water from their hooves. Sharp, peering between tufts of grass, could see 20 Lancers, but looking back to the northern skyline, he saw more appear. And then a group at the place where the hills almost met the river, and he realized that a full French regiment was there, coming south. And as he tried to find rhyme or reason in their presence, he saw the girl jerk the rope free, scrabble backwards, and she was up, white dress brilliant in the murk, and running south towards the hills, to where El Católico and his men were desperately fleeing. He pushed Harper down. "Stay there!" The girl stumbled on the far bank of the stream, lost her balance, turned and saw Sharp coming. She seemed to panic, for she ran downstream past a wide bend in the water, and turned south again. They must see her. Sharp shouted at her to get down, but the wind snatched away the words, and he forced himself on, getting closer, and leapt at her. He crashed into her as she turned to look where he was, and his weight drove her into the gravel beside the stream. She fought at him, snarling, her fingernails scratching at his eyes, but he bore her down, his weight crushing her, took her wrists and forced them apart, ground them into the small, sharp stones, and used all his strength to keep them still. She kicked at him, and he hooked his legs over hers, hammered them down, not caring if he hurt her, thinking only of the 8 feet 10 inches of lance that could pin them both like wriggling insects. The stream ran cold round his ankles, and he knew that Teresa must be lying in water to her waist, but there was no time to care about that, because there were hooves near, and he thrust down his head, cracking her forehead, as a horse splashed by them in the stream. He looked up, saw Jose, the man who had escorted them to the river, shouting down at the girl, his words lost in the whipping rain. Then the partisans' elbows and heels moved, the horse spurred into a frantic gallop, and Sharp saw 3 Lancers, their mouths open in the gaping, silent scream of a cavalry charge, galloping across to trap the Spaniard. Jose twisted, slashed at his horse, found level ground and put his head down, but the Lancers were too close. Sharp watched, saw a Frenchman rise in his stirrups, draw back his lance, and lunge forward so the lance had all the rider's weight behind the steel point that rammed into Jose's back. He arched, screamed into the wind, fell with the pelting rain, and his hands fumbled at his spine to pull at the great spear that was ridden over him. The other 2 Lancers leant into the dying man, thrust down as they slowed their horses, and Sharp heard the snatch of a laugh on the wind. Teresa took a breath, twisted violently, and Sharp knew she was about to scream. She had not seen Jose's death, knew only that El Católico was near, and there was only one thing for Sharp to do. His legs were across hers, hooking hers flat. His hands were on her wrists. So he jammed his mouth on top of hers and forced her head down. She bit at him. Their teeth clashed jarringly, but he twisted his mouth so that his was at a right angle to hers, and using his teeth forced her down into the gravel. One eye glared at him. She jerked beneath him, twisted, but his weight smothered her, and very suddenly she lay still. The voice was close. It seemed almost on top of them, and she could hear, as he could, the crunch of hooves in the gravel. "Ici, Jean!" There was a shout from further away. More hooves, and the girl lay utterly still. Sharp could see the sudden fear in her eye, feel her heart beating beneath his chest, her breath suddenly checked in his mouth. He raised his mouth with its bloodied lip from hers, turned his head infinitely slowly, so that he could see all her face, and whispered, "Lie still. Still." She nodded almost imperceptibly, and Sharp let go of her wrists, though his hand stayed on top of them. The rain seethed down, smashed on his back, dripped from his hair and shako onto her face. The voice came again, still shouting, and Sharp heard through the hissing rain the creak of saddlery and the snorting of a horse. Her eyes stayed on his. He dared not look up, though he desperately wanted to see how close the Lancer was, and he saw her eyes flick upwards and back to his, and there was a new fear in them. She must have seen something. The Frenchman could not be far, looking not for a couple lying in a stream, but for horsemen who had scattered into the rainstorm. Her hand gripped at his. She jerked with a tiny movement of her head, as if to tell him that the Frenchman was close. But he shook his head very slowly, and then, telling himself that a raised head increased the chance of discovery, he lowered his head towards her. The hooves crunched again. The Frenchman laughed, shouted something at his friends, and she kept her eyes open as Sharp kissed her. She could have moved, but she didn't. Her eyes still watched as her tongue explored his cut lip. And Sharp, looking at the huge dark eyes, thought that she was watching him because what was happening to her was so unbelievable that only the evidence of her eyes could confirm it. He watched her, too. The Lancer shouted again, much closer, and then there was a reply, mocking and imperative, suggesting that the closest Lancer had been deceived. A bird, perhaps, in the stream bed, or a running rabbit, and he was being called back. Sharp could hear the horse's hooves crashing in the stream bed, and once, by a break in the wind, the sound seemed so close that the girl's eyes widened in fear. And then the sound receded, the voices faded, and she shut her eyes, kissed him fiercely, and, almost in the same movement, thrust his head away. The 3 Lancers were going, their horses' wet rumps glistening, and Sharp let out a sigh of relief and of regret. "They've gone." She began to move, but he shook his head. "Wait!" She turned her head, raised it so that her cheek touched his, and she hissed when she saw what was at the end of the valley. A convoy, with rows of ox carts whose ungreased axles screamed piercingly through the foul weather, and either side of the plodding carts were the shapes of more horsemen, sabres and lances, escorting the carts southwards towards the Almeida road. It could take an hour for the convoy to pass, but at least it had driven away El Católico and his men, and Sharp realized, with one of the sudden bursts of elation that had punctuated the sense of growing failure for the last week, that as long as the light company was not discovered, they should safely reach the ford when the French had gone. He looked at the girl. "Will you be still?" She nodded. He asked again. She nodded again, and he slowly eased himself off her and lay down beside her. She turned over onto her stomach, and the wet dress clung to her, and he remembered the sight of her naked body, its shadowed slim beauty, and he reached out a hand and took the rope at her neck, turning it so he found the knot, and fumbling at it with wet fingers. The tight, sodden rope yielded slowly, but it was off, and he dropped it to the gravel. "I'm sorry." She shrugged as if it were no matter. There was a chain round her neck, and Sharp, his hand already close, pulled it, to find a square locket made of silver. She watched, her dark eyes utterly expressionless, as he put a thumbnail under the catch and it sprang open. There was no picture, and she gave the hint of a smile because she understood that he had expected one. The inside of the lid was engraved, "My love to you, J." It took him a few seconds to realize that Joachim, El Católico, would never have inscribed a piece of silver in English, and he knew with a sick certainty that it had belonged to Hardy, J for Josephina, and he looked at the silver ring engraved with an eagle that she had bought before Talavera, before Hardy, and with a superstition he did not understand, he touched the locket onto the ring. "He's dead, isn't he?" For a moment her face did not move, but then she nodded. Her eyes dropped to the ring on his finger, and back to his face. "The gold?" "Yes." "You go to Cadiz?" It was Sharp's turn to think, to watch her eyes through the rain dripping from the peak of his shako. "No." "You keep it?" "I think so. But to fight the French, not to take home." "I promise." She nodded and turned to watch the French convoy. Guns coming from the French army of the north and going to Almeida. Not field guns, or even siege artillery, but Bonaparte's favourite 8-inch howitzers, with obscene little muzzles that squatted like cooking pots in their wooden beds, and which could throw explosive shells high into the air to fall into the packed houses of a besieged town. There were carts as well, presumably with ammunition, and all pulled by slow oxen who were prodded with long goads and thrashed by irate cavalrymen. Their progress was not helped by the wind getting under the canvas covers of the carts, whipping the ropes free so that the tarpaulins flapped and writhed like pinioned bats, and the cavalrymen, doubtless cursing the war, fought to cover the precious powder kegs from the unending rain. The solid axles, turning with the wheels, screeched over the sodden valley. Sharp could feel the rain beating on his back, the water in the stream rising to his knees, and he knew that the river would be rising as well, and that with every passing moment his chance of crossing the ford was receding. The water would be too deep. He turned to the girl again. "How did Hardy die?" El Católico. She gave the answer readily enough, and Sharp knew that her loyalty was changing. It was not the kiss. Why does he want the gold? She shrugged as though it were a stupid question. To buy power. For a moment Sharp wondered if she meant soldiers, and then saw she had spoken the truth. The Spanish armies were gone. The government, if it could be called a government, was in faraway Cadiz, and El Católico had an unparalleled chance to build his own empire. From the hills of Old Castile he could fashion a fiefdom that would rival that of the ancient barons who had built the fortresses that dotted the border area. For a ruthless man, the whole country of Spain was one big opportunity. He was still staring at the girl. And you? I want the French dead. The words were spoken with a terrible vehemence. All of them. You need our help. She looked at him very steadily, not liking the truth, but finally nodded. I know. He kept his eyes open and leant forward, kissed her again as the rain lashed at them, and the stream soaked them, and the carts of the French convoy screeched in their ears. She shut her eyes, put her hand behind his head, held him, and he knew it was not a dream. He wanted her. She pulled away, smiled at him for the first time. You know the river rises. He nodded. Can we cross? She glanced at the stream, shook her head. If the rain stops tonight, yes. Sharp had seen the extraordinary speed with which rivers in these dry hills rose and fell. She nodded at the fort. You can't spend the night there. And you? She smiled again. Can I leave? He felt a fool. Yes. I'll stay. What's your name? Richard. She nodded. She looked again at the fortress. You will be safe. We use it. 10 men can stop the entrance. And El Católico? She shook her head. He's frightened of you. He'll wait till tomorrow, when his men come. Rain lashed across the valley, ran from rock and grass, and swelled the stream as the wind tore at the landscape. Half in the water, half out, they waited for the convoy to pass, and for what the next day would bring. The war would have to wait. Chapter 15. Sir? Sir! A hand was shaking his shoulder, and Sharp opened his eyes to see grey daylight on grey walls. Sir? All right. The girl was waking as well, the eyes blinking in surprise before she remembered where she was. He smiled at her. Stay here. He crawled out of the space beneath the stairs, past the soldier who had wakened him, and went over to the gaping hole in the south wall of the tower. Dawn was like a grey mist on the countryside, blurring the trees, the grassland across the river, but he could see wide flecks on the water surface where there had been none the evening before. The water level was sinking fast, and the rocks which marked the ford of San Anton were foaming the river surface. They could cross today, and he lifted his eyes to stare into the western hills as if hoping to see a friendly patrol. He remembered the guns going south the day before, and he paused motionless in the broken gap to listen for the crumping sound of the giant iron siege guns. Silence. The siege of Almeida had not yet started. Sir? Lieutenant Knowles stood in the tower doorway. Lieutenant, visitors, sir, coming down the valley. Sharp grunted, scrambled to his feet, and strapped on his huge sword as he followed Knowles into the courtyard. There was a fire blazing, surrounded by men, and Sharp looked at them. Do you have tea? One of them promised to bring him a cup, and he joined Knowles on the raised rampart that formed the southeastern corner of San Anton's courtyard. He looked into the valley, up past the stream where the girl had lain beneath his body, and the French lancers had first been seen. Were bloody popular this morning? A line of horsemen was riding on the track from Casa Tejada, El Católico's men in force, and among them Kiersey's blue coat. Sharp spat over the rampart into the stream far below. Keep them out, Robert. Don't let anyone, even the Major, inside the walls. His uniform was damp and uncomfortable, and he unstrapped his sword and belts and stripped naked. Get that fire bigger. Use the thorns. Rifleman Jenkins draped Sharp's clothes on stones near the blaze, and Sharp stood shivering, a mug of tea held in his hands, and stared at the 200 horsemen who were aiming for the oak groves where El Cattolico and his men had spent the night. Sharp looked up at the sky, saw the ragged clouds, and knew that the storm had passed. Soon it would be hot, under a shadowless blue, and he wondered how much water the company had. "Sergeant McGovern?" "Sir." "Take 6 men down to the river with all the canteens. Fill them up." McGovern looked at Knowles and back to Sharp. "I've already done it, sir. The lieutenant sent us down." "Oh." He looked at Knowles and growled an apology. "No one interfered with you?" Knowles shook his head. "It's as you said, sir. They're guarding the fort, not the castle." "Any food?" Knowles sighed. He had half hoped, against all experience, that Sharp's morning temper would have been moderated by Teresa. "Just hardtack, sir, and not much of that." Sharp swore, flung the dregs of tea far out towards the oak trees that sheltered El Cattolico's men. "Right, all weapons cleaned." He ignored the grumbles, turned and leant against the rampart. Everyone was better for some sleep, a few hours between sentry duty, but there had not been time or opportunity in the night for the company to check their weapons. The night had gone quietly. Some time after midnight, the rain had stopped, though the wind still blew cold, and Harper had got a small fire going in the shelter of the broken tower, burning the thorn bushes that grew like weeds in the old courtyard. Teresa had been right. The fortress was approached by a single precipitous track, easy to defend, and El Cattolico had left them in peace. Scraps of wispy cloud cleared away from the rising sun. Shadows stretched over the courtyard, and a touch of warmth came which soon would bake the earth dry and sap the company of its small energy. Sharp leant over the rampart. The spate was well over. The water sinking and the rocks that marked the ford had broken the surface and collected ragged bundles of twigs and debris that the sudden flood had scarred from the banks. He saw Kiersey leave the oak grove and head his borrowed horse towards the path which led to the castle. Sharp pulled on his clothes, still damp, and nodded towards the tower. "Keep the girl inside, Robert." Knowles nodded. Sharp was pulling on a damp boot that refused to go over his heel bone. "Damn!" It slipped on. "I'll meet the Major outside, inspect the weapons, and get ready to move." "All ready?" Knowles seemed surprised. "Can't stay here forever." Sharp buttoned his jacket, picked up his sword. "I'll go and give Major Kiersey the good news." Sharp walked briskly down the slope and waved cheerfully at Kiersey. "Morning, sir. A nice one." Kiersey reined his horse, stared down at Sharp with unfriendly eyes. "What have you done, Sharp?" Sharp stared up at the small Major, who was silhouetted by the sun. He had expected anger, but not at him. He had expected Kiersey to be disillusioned at the partisans, and instead the Major's opening words, spoken with a suppressed rage, were spat at Sharp. He replied quietly, "I've brought the gold, sir, nearly all of it, as I was ordered." Kiersey nodded impatiently, as if it were the answer he expected. "You kidnapped the girl, locked up our allies. You have disobeyed my orders. You have turned men who fought for us into men who simply want to kill you." He paused, taking breath, but Sharp interrupted. "And the men who killed Captain Hardy?" Kiersey seemed to slump on his pommel. He stared at Sharp. "What?" "El Cattolico killed him, stabbed him in the back. He's buried beneath a manure heap in the village." Teresa had told him the story during the night. "He found El Cattolico moving the gold. It seems he made a protest, so they killed him. You were saying, sir?" Kiersey shook his head. "How do you know?" For an instant Sharp was about to tell him, and then remembered that no one outside the company knew that Teresa was no longer a prisoner. "I was told, sir." Kiersey was not prepared to give up. He shook his head as if trying to clear a bad dream. "But you stole the gold!" "I obeyed orders, sir." "Whose orders? I am the ranking officer." Sharp suddenly felt sorry for the Major. Kiersey had found the gold, told Wellington, and had never been told of the General's plans. Sharp felt in his pocket, found the square of paper, and hoped that the rain had not soaked through the folds. It had, but the writing was still legible. He handed it up to Kiersey. "There, sir." Kiersey read it, his anger growing. "It says nothing." "It orders all officers to assist me, sir, all." But Kiersey was not listening. He waved the scrap of damp paper towards Sharp. "It says nothing about the gold, nothing. You could have kept this for months." Sharp laughed. It hardly would mention gold, would it, sir? I mean, suppose the Spanish saw the orders. Suppose they guessed what the General intended to do with the gold. Kiersey looked at him. You know? Sharp nodded. It's not going to Cadiz, sir. He said it as gently as he could. Kiersey's reaction was extraordinary. For a few seconds he sat motionless, his eyes screwed tight, and then he tore the paper into shreds, violent gesture after violent gesture. God damn it, Sharp! What? Sharp had tried to save the paper, but too late. Kiersey suddenly realized he had sworn. Remorse and anger fought on his face. Anger won. I have worked, God knows I have worked to help the Spanish and the British to work together, and I am rewarded by this? He held the scraps of paper up, and then with a sudden jerk scattered them into the wind. Are we to steal the gold, Sharp? Yes, sir. That's about the long and short of it. We can't. Kiersey was pleading. Whose side are you on? Sharp made the question brutal. For an instant he thought that Kiersey's rage would come back, would explode into a blow aimed at the rifleman, but Kiersey controlled it, and when he spoke, his words were low and measured. We have honour, Sharp. That is our private strength, our honour. We're soldiers, you and I. We cannot expect riches or dignity or continual victory. We will die probably in battle or in a fever ward, and no one will remember us, so all that is left is honour. You understand? It was strange, standing in the growing warmth of the sun, and listening to the words that were wrenched from the centre of Kiersey's soul. He must have been disappointed, Sharp thought, somewhere in his life. Perhaps he was lonely, spurned by the officers' mess. Or perhaps once in his life the small man had been turned down by a woman he loved, and now, growing old in his honour, he had found a job he loved. Kiersey loved Spain, and the Spanish, and the task of riding alone behind the enemy lines like a Christian who kept the faith in a world of heretics and persecution. Sharp spoke gently. The General spoke to me, sir. He wants the gold. Without it the war is lost. If that's stealing, then we're stealing it. I assume that you will help us. Kiersey seemed not to hear. He was staring over Sharp's head at the tower of the Castillo, and he muttered something so low that Sharp couldn't hear the words. Pardon, sir? Kiersey's eyes flicked to the rifleman. What should it profit a man, Sharp, if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Sharp sighed. I doubt if we're losing our souls, sir, and anyway, do you think that El Católico planned to give the gold to Cadiz? Kiersey slumped on his saddle as if he knew that Sharp had spoken the truth. No, the Major spoke softly. I suppose not. I suppose he wanted to keep it. But he would have used it to fight the French, Sharp. So will we, sir. Yes, but it's Spanish gold and we're not Spaniards. He jerked himself upright and looked somewhat ruefully at the scraps of Sharp's torn orders. We'll take the gold to Wellington, Captain, but under my orders. You must release the girl. Do you understand? I will not be a party to these threats, to this underhand procedure. No, sir. Kiersey looked at him, uncertain whether Sharp was agreeing with him. You do understand, Sharp? I understand, sir. Sharp turned and stared at the Castillo, and then across the Agueda to the far hills, where the French patrols were still waiting, and where the siege guns would be inching their way to the fortress walls of Almeida. I presume the girl has not been harmed? No, sir, she hasn't. Sharp's patience was at an end. If El Católico thought for 1 second that the girl was safe, then his men would fall on the light company, and Sharp would face a death more painful than the imagination could invent. He looked up at Kiersey. In 10 minutes, Major, I'm going to cut off one of her ears, only halfway, so it'll mend. But if any of those murderous bastards with El Católico tries to interfere with our crossing of the ford, then the whole ear will be sliced off, and the other ear, and her eyes, and her tongue. And do you understand me, sir? We are leaving with the gold, and the girl is our passport, and I'm not giving her up. Tell her father, tell El Católico, that if they want the gold, they can collect it with a toothless, blind, deaf, ugly, and dumb girl. Understand? Sharp's anger battered at the Major, drove him 2 steps down the slope. I am ordering you, Sharp. You're ordering nothing, sir. You tore up my orders. We're going, so tell them, Major. Tell them. You hear the scream in 10 minutes. He turned away, his anger deafening him to Kiersey's words, and climbed into the stockade of the fort. His men saw his face and said nothing, but turned away and watched as a small blue-uniformed major rode his horse back to the partisans. Kiersey delivered the message, shaking with rage, and watched, with Cesar Moreno beside him, the high, silent fort. El Católico was with them and swore his vengeance on Sharp. The major touched his sleeve. "He won't do it. Believe me, he won't." Kiersey squinted up at the Castillo, at the silhouettes of the sentries. There was something more on his mind, something that he couldn't keep in, and he turned to the tall Spaniard. "Captain Hardy." He stopped. El Católico soothed his horse, looked at Kiersey. "What about him?" Kiersey was embarrassed. "Well, Sharp says you killed him." El Católico laughed. "He would say anything." He spat onto the ground. "You are the only officer we can trust, Major. Not people like Sharp. He has no proof, does he?" He asked the question confidently. Kiersey shook his head. "No." "He just wants to turn you against us." "No, Major. Captain Hardy was captured. Ask Cesar." He gestured at Therese's father, whose face was tortured with worry. The major shook his head, felt a sense of relief, a feeling that was shattered by the sound that came from the ruined tower of the Castillo. The scream seemed to linger in the oak grove. It rose to an unbearable pitch and then wavered down to a thin, sobbing desperation that chilled every man. Cesar Moreno was spurred forward with a dozen men, his face set with a determination they had forgotten. But a sentry on the ramparts gave a signal to the tower, and the scream came again, higher this time, like the sound of the Frenchmen whose lives they had stripped, inch by inch, with their long knives. Therese's father reined in, knowing he was beaten, swearing that for every blade that was laid to his daughter, Sharp would suffer 100. El Católico had killed northerners before, Frenchmen, and some had taken 3 moons to die, and every second they had known their own pain. Sharp, El Católico promised himself, would plead for such a death. After the sobbing, the noise of boots on stone, came shouted orders, and the company marched out with fixed bayonets on shouldered guns, and in the lead was the captain holding a rifle sling looped round the neck of Teresa Moreno. The partisans growled, looked at the father, at El Católico, but dared not move. Teresa was crying, her face half hidden by her hands, but every man could see the white bandage torn from the bottom of her dress, and they could see the bright blood which stained the cloth. Sharp was holding a gleaming, saw-backed bayonet at her head, and if she stumbled, he pulled at the sling round her throat. Kiersey felt a terrible shame as he watched the rifle officer shield himself from El Católico's guns with the girl's body, and as the company, in a silence that seemed as if it could explode at any instant in a dreadful violence, marched past the poised horseman, Cesar Moreno gazed at the blood-soaked bandage, at the spots of blood on his daughter's dress, and he promised himself the luxury of this English captain's death. Kiersey touched his arm. "I'm sorry." "It does not matter. I will catch them and kill them." Cesar Moreno watched the faces of the company, and he thought they looked shocked, as if their captain had dragged them into new depths of horror. "I will kill him." Kiersey nodded. "I'm sorry." Moreno looked at him. "It was not your doing, Major." He nodded at where the light company were beginning their crossing, the lightly loaded men forming a human dam to help the gold carriers to cross. "Go in peace." Sharp crossed last, holding the girl and feeling the long weeds snatch at his legs and try to drag him under. The water level was low, but the current still strong, and it was awkward with one arm round Theresa's neck, but they made it, and were pulled onto the far bank by Patrick Harper, who nodded back over the river. "Felt sorry for her father, sir." "He'll find out she wasn't touched." "Aye, that's true. The Major's coming." "Let him." They set off across the grassland in the heat of the morning, their boots leaving a wide swathe through the pale stalks, and with the partisans never far behind. Harper walked with Sharp and Teresa, and he looked over the girl's head at his captain. "How's the arm, sir?" "Oh, it's fine." Sharp had cut open his left forearm for the blood with which to soak Theresa's bandage. Harper nodded ahead to the company. "Should have cut open Private Batten, it's all he's good for." Sharp grinned. The thought had occurred to him. but he had rejected it as petty. "I'll survive. You better tell the lads that the girl's not harmed, quietly." "I'll do that." Harper went ahead. The men were silent, shocked, because Sharp had let them believe he was working the great blade on the girl. If they'd known the truth, they would have marched past El Catholico with grinning faces, suppressed glee, and the whole thing would have been lost. Sharp looked at the partisans, to the side and behind, and then at Teresa. "You must keep pretending." She nodded, looking up at him. "You keep your promise?" "I promise. We have a bargain." It was a good one, too, he decided, and he admired Teresa for its terms. At least now he knew why she was on his side, and there was only one regret. He knew they would not be together long, that the bargain called for them to be far apart. But the war would be long, and who knew, perhaps he would meet her again. At midday the company climbed a steep ridge that ran directly west towards their goal, and Sharp led the way up its steep razor-stone flank with a sense of relief. The partisans could not take their horses up the slope, and their figures grew smaller and smaller as the company laboured upwards. The men carrying the goal needed frequent rests, lying and panting beneath the sun, but each hour took them nearer the Coa, and for a time Sharp dared to hope that they had shaken off El Catholico and his men. The spine of the ridge was a bare, rocky place, and littered with small bones left by wolves and vultures. Sharp had the feeling of walking in a place where no man ever trod, a place that was commanded by the beasts, and all round them the hills crouched in the searing, aching sun, and nothing moved except for the company crawling along the high crest, and Sharp felt as if the world had ended and they had been forgotten. Ahead he could see the hazed hills that led to the river, to safety, and he forced the company on. Patrick Harper, carrying 2 packs of gold, nodded at the western hills to their front. "Are the French there, sir?" Sharp shrugged. "Probably." The sergeant looked round their high, sun-bleached path. "I hope they're not watching for us. Better than being down with the partisans." But he knew Harper was right. If the French were patrolling the hills, and they must be, then the company would be visible for miles. Sharp made his own gold-filled pack more comfortable on his shoulder. "We'll keep going west in the night." He looked at his tired men. "Just this one effort, Sergeant, just this one." It was not to be. At dusk, as the westering sun dazzled them, the ridge dropped away, and Sharp saw they had been cheated. The ridge was like an island, separated from the other hills by a wide, convoluted valley, and in its shadows, far below, he could see the tiny dots that were El Catholico's men. He stopped the company, let them rest, and stared down. "Damn, damn, damn!" He spoke quietly. The partisans had ridden an easy path either side of the ridge, and the company had slogged its useless toil over the baking rocks, the edge stones, the scorpion-infested ridge. On the far side of the valley the hills rose again, and he looked at the bouldered slope they would have to climb. But he knew that before they could go on, they must cross the valley. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Like an indented sea-coast, the valley had hidden spurs, deep shadows, even to the north some scrubby trees. Once they were on the valley's grassed floor, they would be terribly vulnerable, unable to see what lurked behind the spurs of the hill and the dead folds of ground. Sharp stared into the shadowed depth, and then at his exhausted company with their battered weapons and heavy packs. "We cross at dawn." "Yes, sir." Harper looked down. "The Major's coming, sir." Kearsey had abandoned his horse, and, his blue uniform melding with the shadows, was climbing the slope towards the company. Sharp grunted. "And he can say a prayer for us." He looked at the valley. A prayer, maybe, would not be a bad thing.
End of Disc 5. Disc 6.
Chapter 16. The water in the canteens was brackish, the food down to the last mildewed crumbs, and in the hour before dawn the ground was slippery with dew. It was cold. The company, foul-mouthed and evil-tempered, slithered and fell as they went down the dark hillside to the Black Valley. Kearsey, his steel scabbard crashing against rocks, tried to keep up with Sharp. "Almeida, Sharp, it's the only way." Sharp stopped, towered over the Major. "Damn Almeida, sir. There's no need for cursing, Sharp." Kearsey sounded peevish. He had arrived as night fell and launched himself into a rehearsed condemnation of Sharp that had petered out when he saw an undamaged Teresa calmly watching him. She had spoken to him in Spanish, driving down his objections, until the Major, confused by the speed of events that he could not control, had fallen into an unhappy silence. Later, when the wind stirred the night grass, and sentries twitched as the black rocks seemed to move, he had tried to persuade Sharp to turn south. Now, in the creeping dawn, he had returned to the subject. "The French, Sharp, you don't understand. They'll be blocking the Cour. You must go south. And damn the bloody French, sir." Sharp turned away, slipped and cursed as a boot flew from beneath him, and he sat down painfully on a stone. He would not go to Almeida. The French were about to start the siege, and would be concentrating in force. He would go west, towards the Coa, and take the gold to the general. The turf on the valley floor was springy, easy to walk, but Sharp crouched and hissed at his men to be quiet. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and his instinct told him the partisans had gone. Sergeant Harper crouched beside him. "Bastards have gone, sir. They're somewhere, not here. And if not, then why had they gone? El Católico would not give up the gold, nor Moreno the chance to punish the man whom he thought had mutilated his daughter, so why was the valley so empty and quiet?" Sharp led the way over the grass, his rifle cocked, and looked at the hill ahead, littered with rocks, and he imagined the muskets ambushing them as they climbed. The hillside could hide 1,000 men. He stopped again at the foot of the slope, and the eerie feeling came back of being alone in the world, as if, while they were walking on the ridge the day before, the world had ended and the angel of death had forgotten the light company. Sharp listened. He could hear his men breathing, but nothing else. Not the scrabble of a lizard on the rocks, the thump of a frightened rabbit. No birds, not even the wind on the stones. He found Kiersey. "What's over the hill, sir?" Summer pasture for sheep, spring water, 2 shelters, cavalry country." "North?" "A village." "South, sir?" "The road to Almeida." Sharp bit his lip, stared up the slope and pushed away the sensation of being alone. His instinct told him that the enemy was near, but which enemy? Ahead was foraging country, enemy patrols, and Kiersey had claimed that the French would hold the countryside in force so that they could strip it of food. And if the French were not there— He looked behind at the valley, and was tempted to stay in the low ground, but where was El Católico? Waiting up the valley? Or had his men hidden the horses and climbed the hill? He knew the company was nervous, frightened both of the stillness and Sharp's caution, and he stood up. "Rifles! Skirmish line! Lieutenant! Follow with the company! Forward!" This, at least, was a trade they knew, and the riflemen split into skirmishing pairs and spread out into the thin elastic screen that sheltered the main battle line in a fight. The rifles were trained to this, taught to think independently, and to fight on their own initiative without orders from an officer. One man moved as his partner covered him. Just as in battle, one man reloaded while the other watched to see if any enemy was aiming at his comrade during the vulnerable and clumsy wielding of ramrod and cartridge. 50 yards behind the greenjackets, clumsy and noisy, the redcoats climbed the hill, and Teresa stayed with Knowles and watched the elusive shapes, fleeting glimpses of the riflemen. She was wearing Sharp's greatcoat, covering the white dress, and she could sense the apprehension among the men. The world seemed empty, the dawn rising on grey rocks and limitless grass. But Teresa knew, better even than Sharp, that only one thing could have driven away the partisans, and that the world was not empty. Somewhere, watching them, were the French. The sun rose behind them, lancing its light across the ridge they had walked the day before, and Sharp, ahead of the riflemen, saw it touch gold on the hill crest 70 yards ahead. The rock was covered in light, and at its base, half hidden by shadowed grass, was a dull red colour, and he turned casually and waved his men flat as if he wanted to give them a rest. He yawned massively, stretched his arms, and sauntered across the line to where Harper had stopped the left-hand pairs. He looked down the slope and waved at Knowles, laconically indicating for the heavily laden group to lie down, and then he nodded amicably at the sergeant. "Bloody voltigeurs on the crest." Voltigeurs, the French skirmishers, the light infantry who fought against the British light companies. Sharp squatted on the ground, his back to the enemy, and talked softly. "Saw the red epaulette." Harper looked over Sharp's shoulder. flicking his eyes along the crest, and swore quietly. Sharp plucked a blade of grass and pushed it between his teeth. Another 20 yards, and they would have been in range of the French muskets. He swore as well. Harper squatted. "And if there are infantry, sir, there are bloody cavalry as well." Harper jerked his head sideways down the slope to the empty, still-shadowed valley. "There?" Sharp nodded. "They must have seen us yesterday, walked on a bloody ridge like virgins." He spat into the grass, scratched irritably through the torn hole in his left sleeve. "Bloody Spanish!" Harper yawned for the benefit of the watching enemy. "Time we had a proper fight, sir." He spoke mildly. Sharp scowled. "If we could choose where." He stood up. "We go left." The hillside to the left, to the south, offered more cover, but he knew with a terrible certainty that the light company was outnumbered by the enemy and almost certainly outflanked as well. He blew his whistle, waved to the south, and the company moved along the side of the hill while Sharp and Harper quietly and slowly warned the riflemen of the enemy skirmishers above. Kearsey climbed up from the redcoats. "What are we doing, Sharp?" Sharp told him about the skirmishers above. Kearsey looked triumphant, as if it had been proved right. "Told you, Sharp. Pastureland village. They're locking up the country and the food. So, what you do now?" "What we do now, sir, is get out of this." "How?" "I have no idea, Major, no idea." "Told you, Sharp. Capturing eagles is all very well, but out here in enemy country things are different, eh? El Catholico didn't get caught. Must have smelt the French and vanished. We're sitting ducks." "Yes, sir." There was no point in arguing. If El Catholico had the gold, he would not even have come this far. But as Sharp worked his way round the hill, he knew that at any moment the journey could end, the men with the gold caught between voltigeurs and cavalry. And in a month's time someone at the army headquarters would wonder idly whatever happened to Captain Sharp and the light company that was sent on the impossible job of bringing back Spanish gold. He turned on Kearsey. "So where is El Catholico?" "Well, I doubt if he'll help you, Sharp." "But he won't give up the gold, will he, Major? I suppose he's happy to let the French ambush us, and then he'll ambush them, right?" Kearsey nodded. "It's his only hope." Rifleman Tongue, educated and argumentative, spun round. "Sir!" The shout was his last. The bang of a musket muffled it, the smoke hanging in front of a rock just 20 yards from him, and Tongue went on spinning and falling, and Sharp ignored Kearsey and ran ahead. Harper was crouching and searching for the man who'd fired at Tongue. Sharp raced past, knelt by the rifleman, and lifted up the head. "Aye, sir." The head was heavy. The eyes were sightless. The musket ball had gone cleanly between two ribs and killed him even as he shouted the warning. Sharp could hear the ramrod rattle as the enemy skirmisher pushed his next round into the barrel. Then the unseen enemy's partner fired, the ball missing Sharp by inches, because the Frenchman had suddenly seen Harper. The sergeant's rifle bullet lifted the Frenchman up off the ground. He opened his mouth to scream, but only blood came out, and he dropped back. Sharp could still hear the scraping of the iron ramrod. He stood up with Tongue's rifle and ran forward. The voltigeurs saw him coming, panicked and scrambled backwards, and Sharp shot him in the base of the spine, and watched the man drop his musket and fall in agony to the hillside. Parry Jenkins, Tongue's partner, seemed almost in tears. The Welshman stooped over Tongue's body, unbuckling the ammunition pouch and canteen, and Sharp threw him the dead man's rifle. "Here!" A French ball thudded into his pack, pushing him forward, and he knew that the enemy's skirmish line had bent down the hill, cutting their southward advance, and he waved his men down and ran back to Jenkins. "Have you got everything?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. God, I'm sorry, sir." Sharp hit him on the shoulder. "Come on, Parry, not your fault. Down!" They went down the hill, the musket balls over their heads, and found cover in the rocks. Tongue's body would have to stay there. Another rifleman lost in Spain. Or was this Portugal? Sharp didn't know. But he thought of the school in the Midlands where Tongue had once taught, appropriately enough, languages, and he wondered if anyone would remember the clever young man with the friendly eyes who took to drink. "Sir?" Knowles was pointing behind, and Sharp rolled over and looked back the way they'd come. French skirmishers in faded blue jackets with red epaulettes were angling down the hill behind them. He stayed on his back, facing his men. "Rifles! Bayonets!" The French would understand that all right, and feel the fear. He had unconsciously counted the bullets that missed him when he went forward to Tung's body, and he knew, though he had not thought about it, that the hillside in front was sparsely held. The French had put a skirmish line there, thin and spaced, thinking it was enough to drive the British back downhill, where, still unseen, the cavalry must wait. "Lieutenant? Sir? You'll follow us." "We buy 10 minutes," he thought, "but we might get outside their cordon, and we might find a place to defend." He knew it was hopeless, but it was better than being driven like fat sheep, and he tugged out his sword, felt its edge, and was on his feet. "Forward!" One man of each pair watched, the other ran, and Sharp heard the Bakers cracking the morning apart as the Frenchmen put up their heads to fire at the small, spread band of men in green, who screamed at them and had 23 inches of steel fixed to their rifles. The few skirmishers in their front ran, or else died from the spinning rifle bullets that could not miss at 50 paces, and the company kept running. Sharp was ahead, his sword across his body, and his rifle bumping on his back. He saw skirmishers above them on the hillside, and below, but muskets were a terrible instrument for precision work, and he let the enemy fire, and he knew the odds were in the company's favour. One man went down, hit in the buttocks, but he was dragged up, and they were through the gap, and there were just a few panicked French fugitives ahead who hadn't the sense to climb the hill. One turned, reached with his musket, and found himself faced with a giant Irishman who spit him neatly between the ribs, kicked the blade free, and went on. Sharp cut at a man with his sword, felt the bone-hammering jar as the Frenchman parried with his musket, and then he ran on and wondered what kind of a dent he had put in the heavy steel edge. "Come on! Uphill!" That was not what the French expected, so it was the only way to go. The company had smashed the cordon, lost only one man, and now they forced their tired legs to go up the slope, towards the western crest. And behind them the French orders rang out, the blue-coated officers realigning their men. And there was no time for anything but to force the legs up the impossible slope, feel the pain as the breath hurt the lungs. And then Sharp made the crest, and without stopping turned and kept running. The damn French were there, not expecting the British, but there all the same, and lined up in files and ranks waiting for orders. Sharp had a glimpse of a gently falling slope well grassed, and the French battalion lined in companies, and the French watched astonished as the British ran past their front only 100 paces away, and not a musket was fired. There was no escape to the west, none to the north where the skirmishers chased them, and Sharp knew they must go south and east where the cavalry expected them. It was the only direction that gave time, and time was the only hope. He turned, waved the rifleman down, and pushed Knowles and the red-jacketed men down the slope. "Form up 100 paces down." "Sir." Knowles acknowledged, leapt over a boulder, and the company was gone. "Rifles! Hold them up!" This was a better way of fighting, letting the enemy come to them, and killing them when they were too far away to reply to the rifle fire. Sharp fought as a private, ramming the balls down the rifling, picking his targets, and waiting for the victim to rush forward. He aimed low, never waited to see if the man fell, but dragged out another cartridge, bit off the bullet, and started to reload. He could hear the rifles around him, firing as fast as they could, which was not fast enough, and he knew that the French would come to their senses soon, and overwhelm them with targets and rush them with bayonets. He heard Harper giving instructions, and wondered which of the riflemen needed to be told that you wrapped the bullet in the small greased patch so that it gripped the rifling. And he was so curious that he dodged through the lingering smoke and saw Teresa, with Tung's weapon, her face already blackened with powder smoke, kneeling up to fire at a Frenchman. Then the enemy disappeared, gone to ground, and Sharp knew the rush was coming. "Forget the patches!" It was faster to load a naked ball, even though the rifle lost its accuracy. And then he whistled at them, pulling them back, keeping low, so that the enemy would charge an empty piece of ground and find itself under fire from new cover. "Wait for them!" They waited. There were French shouts, French cheers, and the men in blue and red were crisscrossing towards them, muskets and bayonets catching the light. And still they came, and Sharp knew they were outnumbered horribly. But it was always best to wait. Wait! Wait! He saw a confused enemy officer, looking for the British, and knew the man would lose his nerve in just a second. "Fire!" It was a small volley, but the last they would fire with greased patches, and it was murderous. The enemy dived for cover, threw themselves behind rocks or their own dead, and the riflemen reloaded, spitting the bullets into the guns, tapping them down by hammering the butts on the ground and not even bothering with ramrods. "Back!" There were 100 skirmishers in front of them, pressing forward, lapping them, and the riflemen went back, tap-loading, firing at their enemies and always losing ground, going downhill towards the rest of the company, who were getting closer and closer to the open ground of the valley. "Back!" It was no place to die, this, not while the cavalry had still not appeared, and there was a chance, however slim, that the company could fall back to the far side of the valley. There was no time to think of that, only to keep the riflemen out of range of the muskets, to harry the company down the hill, stopping and firing, running, reloading, and finding new cover. They were doing no damage to the enemy, but the French, terrified of rifles, kept their distance, and didn't seem to realize that the bullets were no longer spinning, that, bereft of the small leather patch, the rifles were less accurate than the ordinary musket. It was enough for the French that their opponents wore green, the grasshoppers of the British Army, who could kill at 300 paces and tear the heart out of an enemy skirmish line. Pausing to watch the men go back, Sharp glanced up the hill and saw the crest lined with the French companies. He noticed the uniforms were bright, unfaded by the sun, and he knew that this was a fresh regiment, one of the new regiments that had been sent by Bonaparte to finish the Spanish business once and for all. Their colonel was giving them a grandstand view of the fight, and it annoyed Sharp. No damn French recruit was going to watch his death. He looked at the voltigeurs, trying to find an officer to aim for, and it struck him, as he banged his rifle butt on the ground, that only 20 minutes ago he had felt as if he were utterly alone on the face of the planet. Now he was outnumbered 10-1, and the bastards were still coming, bolder now as the British reached the foot of the slope, and a ball smacked into the rock beside him, and glanced up to hit Sharp's left armpit. It hurt like a dog chewing his flesh, and, throwing up the rifle for a quick shot, he suddenly knew the ricochet had done damage. He could hardly hold the rifle. But he squeezed the trigger and went backwards, keeping pace with his men and looking behind him, to see Knowles pausing on the very edge of the valley, like a man fearful of pushing away from the shore. God damn it, there was no choice. "Back! Back!" He ran to Knowles. "Come on, cross the valley!" Knowles was looking at his shoulder. "Sir, you're hit!" "It's nothing, come on!" He turned to the riflemen, red eyes peering from blackened faces. "Form up, lads!" The girl fell in like another rifleman, and he grinned at her, loving her for fighting like a man, for her eyes that sparkled with the hell of it, and then he waved his right arm. "March!" They went away from the rocks, from the voltigeurs, out into the unnatural calmness of the grass. The French infantry didn't follow, but stopped at the foot of the slope for all the world as if the light company were on a boat and they couldn't follow. Major Kearsey was jigging with the excitement, his sabre drawn, but his smile went as he saw Sharp. "You're hit." "It's nothing, sir, a ricochet." "Nonsense, man!" Kearsey touched Sharp's shoulder, and to the rifleman's surprise the hand came away red and glistening. "I've had worse, sir, it'll mend." It was hurting, though, and he hated the thought of peeling away jacket and shirt to find the wound. Kearsey looked back at the motionless French infantry. "They're not following, Sharp." "I know, sir." His tone was gloomy, and Kearsey glanced sharply at him. "Cavalry?" "Bound to be, sir. Waiting for us to get into the centre of the valley." "What do we do?" Kearsey seemed to see nothing odd in asking Sharp the question. "I don't know, sir. You pray." Kearsey took offence, jerking his head back. "I have prayed, Sharp, precious little else for the last few days." It had been only a few days, Sharp thought. And was it all to end like this, between a French battalion and cavalry? Sharp grinned at the Major, spoke gently. "Keep praying, sir." It was thin pasture land, close-cropped and tough, and Sharp looked at the grass and thought that in a year's time the sheep would be back, as if there had been no skirmish. The sun had reached the valley floor, and insects were busy in the grass stems, oblivious of the battle overhead, and Sharp looked up and thought the valley was beautiful. It wound south and west, climbing between steep hills, and ahead of him, out of reach, was a stream bed that in spring would make the place a small paradise. He looked behind, saw the voltigeurs sitting by the rocks, the other French companies coming slowly down the hill, and somewhere in the tortuous valley he knew the cavalry would be waiting. He was sure they would come from behind now. The way ahead seemed to offer no hiding place, and he knew the company was trapped. He looked at the ground, level and firm, and imagined the horses walking the first 100 yards, trotting the next 50, into the canter, the swords raised, and the final gallop of 20 yards that would be split by the fire of the small square. But 40 infantry could not hold out long. Pipe smoke went up from the sitting French infantry, front seats for the slaughter. Patrick Harper fell in beside him. "How bad?" He was looking at the shoulder. "It'll mend." The sergeant grabbed his elbow, and ignoring Sharp's protest, pulled the arm up. "Does it hurt?" "Jesus!" He could feel a grating in the shoulder, but the huge Irishman's hands were there, squeezing and hurting. Harper let go. "There's no bone broken, sir. The ball's trapped. Ricochet?" Sharp nodded. A full hip would have broken his shoulder and upper arm. It hurt. Harper looked at the girl and back to Sharp. "That'll impress the wee girl." "Go to hell." "Yes, sir." Harper was worried, trying not to show it. Trumpets sounded, and Sharp stopped, turned, and as the company marched on he saw the first horses appear to the north. His heart sank. Lancers again, always bloody lancers, and their green uniforms and pink facings mocked his meagre hopes. The lancers were tipped with red and white pennants, held jauntily, and they trotted into formation in the valley and stared at the small group of British infantry. Harper came back to him. 200, sir?" "Yes." He had heard men say they would rather die of a lance than a sabre, that a sabre just gave horrific cuts that festered and bled a man dry over weeks of agony, whereas a lance was quick and deep. Sharp spat into the grass. He cared for neither, and he looked left and right. "That way." He pointed to the eastern side of the valley, back the way they'd come, away from the French infantry. "On the double!" They ran. A lurching, stumbling, hopeless run, because even if the lancers waited a full 2 minutes before they were ordered forward, they would still catch the light company and lean their weight into the silver blades. Then it really was all over, the whole thing hopeless, and Sharp remembered the stories of small bands of soldiers who fought out against hopeless odds. He'd been wrong. There was a hiding place further up the valley, a deep fold of dead ground to the south that had been shadowed and hidden. But suddenly he saw horsemen were filing from it, men in foreign uniforms, sabres drawn, and they weren't waiting like the lancers. Instead they trotted forward knee to knee, and Sharp knew it was all over. "Halt! Company square!" He put the girl in the centre with Kiersey. "Bayonets!" They did it calmly, and he was proud of them. His shoulder hurt like the devil, and he suddenly remembered the rumour that had gone through the army that the French poisoned their musket balls. He had never believed it, but something was wrong. Everything blurred, and he shook his head to clear his vision, and gave his rifle to Kiersey. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't hold it." His sword was still drawn, a dent in the foreblade, and he pushed his way through to the front of the tiny square, an almost useless gesture of defiance, and suddenly realized his men were grinning. They looked at him, started to cheer, and he tried to order silence. Perhaps it was a fine way to die, to cheer the enemy on to the bayonets, but it made no sense to Sharp. They should save their breath for the killing. The sabres were nearer, the men riding like veterans without excitement or haste, and Sharp tried to place the French regiment with blue uniforms, a yellow stripe on the overalls, and tall brown busbies. God damn it, who were they? At least a man should know who he's fighting. Sharp tried to order the muskets up, for the men to take aim, but nothing happened. His voice faded. His eyes seemed not to see. Harper caught him, lowered him gently. "Hold on, sir, for God's sake, hold on." Captain Lossow, resplendent in blue and yellow, saw Sharp fall, cursed that his squadron had been delayed, and then, like a good professional of the King's German Legion, forgot about Sharp. There was work to be done. Chapter 17. Lossow had 2 minutes, no more, and he used them well. He saw the company disappear behind his left shoulder, and then the lancers were all that was ahead of him, while far off to the left a battalion of infantry scrambled untidily down the hill to add their firepower to the valley. He would not wait for the infantry. He spoke to his trumpeter, listened to the charge, loved every note, and then he put his sabre in the air and let Thor have his head. A good name for a horse, Thor. Especially a horse like this one that could bite a man's face off, or beat an enemy down with his hooves. It was good ground, comfortable, with no damned rabbits, and Losov would pray at night for an opportunity like this. Lancers, idiots with long spikes who never knew how to parry, and all you had to do was get inside the point and the life was yours. He could hear his men galloping behind. He twisted in the saddle to see the fine sight, the horses neck and neck, as they should be, clods of turf flung up behind, blades and teeth shining. And was it not good of the German king who sat on the English throne to give him this chance? The French were slow, and he guessed they were new troops, on remounts, and the lancer should always meet the enemy at full speed or he was done. He steered Thor to the right. They had practiced this, and the trumpeter gave the call again, ragged this time because of the motion of the horse, but enough to make a man's blood run cold. And he touched Thor with his left heel, never a spur in his life, and the huge horse turned like a dancer. The sabre was dropped so it pointed down like a spike from Losov's outstretched hand, and he galloped, laughing along the face of the enemy, and simply knocked the lancers away. It would not last, it never did, and someone was bright enough to face him, but by then the chaos he had created in half a dozen Frenchmen had let his first troop into the gap, and Losov knew the job was done, and he let Thor rear up and deal with the brave fellow who challenged him. The trumpeter was there, of course, because that was his duty. "Left!" Losov ordered, and the Germans turned, chewing up the French line, the sabres wicked in their work, and Losov was satisfied. "Lieutenant!" The man saluted, oblivious of the fight. "Sir?" "Stir up the infantry! Sir!" And his duty was done. He had a minute left, and Thor needed exercise, so Losov touched with his heels, and the horse went forward, and the sabre turned a galloping lance so neatly that Losov thought he would remember that moment till the day he died, preferably in Germany, and the Kliegenthaler steel of the curved blade opened the Frenchman's throat as far as his spine, and he wished that every moment was this good, with a fine horse, a good turf, a blade made by the dwarves themselves, and an enemy for breakfast. He watched his men work, proud of them. They were disciplined, protecting one another, their sword drill immaculate and thorough. And Losov knew why the Lord Wellington preferred German cavalry. Not as flashy as English, not as good for a parade, but for killing Frenchmen, they were as good as British infantry at that. Losov, a happy man, thought in the valley's bottom, as part of his mind watched the enemy infantry, another checked on the fleeing lancers, that this army, Wellington's army, could be as perfect an instrument of war as any in history. With men like these horsemen and with that infantry, it was beautiful. "Recall!" The trumpet sounded. The men pulled back in perfect order, and Losov waved the sabre. The lancers were done for, utterly beaten. But he had expected no less. Poor devils. They weren't to know that Losov's men had tracked this valley for 3 days, waiting for a sight of Sharp. And Losov was glad it was he, and not that pig Schwalbach further south, who had found the British infantry. He looked up the valley. The rescued infantry were moving fast, each man holding on to a cavalryman's stirrup, and Losov brought the other 150 sabres back slowly, screening the retreat, enjoying the warm sun, and saluting the French infantry who were forming up too late, their show spoiled. "Compliments of Hanover!" he shouted, but the garlic-eating slime did not understand German. An hour later, Sharp opened his eyes, saw Harper leaning over him, pinning him to the ground, and Teresa was holding one hand. And then a German soldier came to him with a piece of iron, glowing hot, and Sharp knew the dream of the last few minutes, of his shoulder being pinned by an Indian with a lance, was just that, a dream. The Indian, turbaned and smiling, had played with him, and every time Sharp had tried to jerk free, the lance would come back, hoisting him a little higher. "Still, Captain." Harper spoke gently, gripped hard. The cauterizing iron hit him like the devils of hell. His sharp was cut off as he fainted, as the flash burned and stank, and it took all Harper's strength to hold him down. But it was done, and Losov's horse doctor nodded his satisfaction. They splashed water on his face, trickled brandy into his throat, and Sharp opened his eyes, grimaced as the pain shot through him, and struggled upwards. He looked at Harper. "You said it would mend. Didn't want to worry you, sir. Almost bled to death. He propped Sharp against a rock. Food! Bring that food! Sharp looked up to see a German officer with crinkled eyes and a good smile looking down on him. He'd met the man before. Where? He remembered. In the village where Batten had been caught by the provosts. He stuck out his good hand. Captain Losov, sir, at your service. Sharp smiled, a bit wanly. You have our thanks, sir. The German waved away the formality. On the contrary, you have ours. A lovely fight. Did you lose anyone? Lose anyone? They were lances, Captain. An angry toad would be more dangerous. Now, if they put lances in the front rank and sabres behind, they might be dangerous. But just lances, no problem to us. Sharp nodded, grateful. But thank you. Losov took the mug of stew from Harper and put it on Sharp's lap. You got the gold? You know about it. Why do you think I'm here? A patrol to the south, me here, and all for you, Captain. The Lord Wellington wants the gold badly. Kearsey sniffed, said nothing, and Sharp sipped at the stew. It tasted miraculous after the hard tack of the last week. He can have it. Yeah, but there are problems. Sharp put the mug down, willed the pain in his shoulder to go down. Problems? French patrols. Losov's hand described an arc to the west. Like fleas on a bottom. Sharp laughed, and the pain came back. But he forced his left hand round to hold the hot mug, and it worked. He spooned the tough beef into his mouth. We must get to the army. I know. We must. He looked to his right and saw one of Losov's men sharpening his sword, using a stone and oil to smooth down the dent. It was only this morning that he'd cut down on the voltigeur, and the man, Sharp remembered Yellow Teeth, had pushed his musket up and saved his life. We must. We will try. Sharp lifted Losov's brandy bottle. The Germans were never short of catch of brandy, and the spirit flowed like cream into his throat. He coughed. The partisans! Have you seen partisans? Losov turned and spoke to one of his officers. A short exchange, and turned back to Sharp. 2 miles away, Captain, keeping in touch with us. They want the gold? Sharp nodded. And me. He looked at the girl and back to the German. Don't worry, Captain. Losov stood up and hitched his sword belt round. You're in good hands. The girl smiled at Sharp, stood up and came to him. Her dress was another 4 inches shorter, and Sharp realized he had been bandaged after the cauterizing iron had driven him in agony back to unconsciousness. She still had the rifle, slung proprietorially on a shoulder, with Tung's ammunition pouch and bayonet strapped to her waist. Losov moved to one side to let her sit by Sharp. Any more wounded, Captain, and she'll be naked. The German captain laughed. We should all cut ourselves. Teresa looked at Sharp, spoke softly. The captain's already seen me, haven't you? How did she know, Sharp thought. He wondered if his telescope was undamaged by the fight, and he remembered a French bullet thumping into his pack and throwing him forward. He couldn't be bothered to check right now, but leaned back, sipped at the brandy, and slept in the sun. The girl sat beside him, watching the light company rest, while beyond them, beyond the tethered horses, Losov's pickets watched French patrols comb the western valleys. The light company would move soon, cutting westward, but for now they could sleep and forget the one more river they had to cross. Chapter 18. Dogs barked in the town. Horses moved restless feet on the wooden stable-boards, and on the stone front steps the sentries shuffled in the darkness. In the hallway of the house a clock ticked heavily, but in the ground-floor room lit by candles the only sound was the rustling of paper, until the tall, hooked-nosed man leant back and tapped a long finger on the table's edge. The siege has not begun? No, my lord. The general leant forward and drew a square map towards him, scraping it over the table, and put the long finger on a white space in its centre. Here? Major Michael Hogan leant into the candlelight. The map showed the country from Celorico, where they sat, across the border to Ciudad Rodrigo. crawling up the map, dividing it into three, were the Coa and Agueda rivers, and the long finger was pointing between the rivers north of Almeida. "As best we can judge, my lord."
"And what is there, pray?"
The general's finger relaxed and traced an unconscious line down to the writing on the bottom. "Drawn by Major Kearsey, Quartermaster General's Department." Hogan wondered idly when Kearsey had drawn the map, but it didn't matter. He drew a piece of paper to him. "4 new French battalions, sir. We know the 118th of the line are there, probably at strength. A regiment of lancers, one of chasseurs." There was a brief silence. Wellington snorted.
"After food, I suppose."
"Yes, my lord."
"And round the town?"
Another piece of paper.
A loose ring, my lord, mostly to the south where the artillery park is building. We know of just 2 battalions of foot and, of course, cavalry patrols." "They're slow, Hogan, slow."
"Yes, sir." Hogan waited. If the French were slow, all to the good, and the reports that filtered back from partisans and exploring officers suggested that Massena was having problems assembling his transport, his siege materials, and, above all, his rations. There was also a rumour that he was with his mistress and reluctant to leave the comfort of her bedroom for the discomforts of the campaign. The general put his hand back on the map.
"Nothing from the KGL?"
"Nothing, sir."
"Damn, damn, damn."
The words were spoken softly, almost reflectively. He picked up a letter postmarked London and read it aloud, though Hogan suspected the words were known by heart.
"I write in confidence, trusting to your discretion that, however precarious the position of the army, it is matched by our own. An opposition rampant, a press malignant, an ailing monarch, and there can be no hopes for a further draft of moneys before the autumn. We put our faith in your exertions."
He put down the letter, dismissing the new government's fears, and looked at the map.
"I wonder where he is."
It was not like the general, Hogan reflected, to articulate his worries. "If I know him, my lord, and I do, then I suspect he'll be avoiding Almeida, coming the direct way."
"He'd be better off in Almeida."
"He would, my lord, but no one could expect that, and in 2 days—" Hogan shrugged. "In 2 days the enemy would lock up the town as effectively as the countryside." The general frowned, drummed the table with his fingers.
"Do I warn Cox?"
The question was asked of himself, not Hogan, but the Irishman knew what was in Wellington's mind. The fewer people who knew of the gold, the better. The Spanish government, in impotent obscurity at Cadiz, would assume the gold to have been captured by the French when the armies collapsed in the north. And if they were to discover that their allies, the British, had purloined it— no. The general's fingers slapped down in finality. He wouldn't burden Almeida's commander with another problem.
"If Sharp is alive, Hogan will assume he does what you say. Avoid Almeida."
He dismissed the problem, looked up at the Irishman.
"How does the work go?"
"Well, my lord, excellently, but—"
"I know, the money. Well, can it wait a week?"
10 days. Wellington's eyebrows went up in mock surprise.
Some good news. Let's hope for more."
He passed on to other business, to a general order that limited field officers' leave in Lisbon to just 24 hours. If they couldn't find a woman in that time, the general claimed, they might as well not stay on and look. There would be only one exception. The blue eyes looked at Hogan.
"If that damned rogue gets back, give him a month."
The damned rogue, with a hurting shoulder and a seething sense of frustration, was riding a horse into the intricate defences of Almeida. Lossow rode beside him. "I'm sorry, Sharp, they had no choice." I know. It was true, too, however grudgingly he admitted it. Every move was headed off by damned Frenchmen, who seemed to be everywhere. They'd been chased twice, lost a German trooper, and in the end, exhausted and hunted, they turned for the safety of the town. Sharp had wanted to lay up in the country, travel in darkness, but the French were alerted, and he knew that there was no sense in being chased ragged round the east bank of the Coa. Straw torches, soaked in resin, flamed and smoked in the tunnel gateway, casting lurid shadows on the Portuguese infantry, who had dragged open the huge doors and now watched the tired men ride and walk into the town. The insides of Sharp's legs were sore. He hated riding horses, but Lossow had insisted. The gold was all on horseback, carried by the Germans, and Sharp looked at them, all alert, and then at Lossow. Why don't we ride straight through out the other side? Losov laughed. They must be fed. The horses, I mean. One good din of corn and they'll go through the French like the pox through a regiment. We go in the morning, yeah? Dawn? Yes, my friend, dawn. There was still hope. The French hadn't even surrounded Almeida. They'd ridden the last few miles unmolested, and Sharp guessed that the cavalry patrols were concentrated to the north. In the southern sky, beyond the bulk of the castle, he could see the glow of fires, and assumed that the French had chosen the easier countryside in which to build their artillery park. To the west, where the river was so tantalizingly close, he had seen no fires except in the distance, and they were British. Success was so close. Kiersey, on yet another borrowed horse, led the procession into the plaza. The castle and cathedral were close to the northern gate where they'd entered, and the big plaza seemed to be the only inhabited place in the town. Sharp looked for Knowles. "Lieutenant?" "Sir?" "Go to the lower town. You'll find billets. Knock a house open." There were dozens of empty houses. "Meet me back here. Sergeant?" Harper came alongside the horse, and Sharp gestured at Teresa. "She'll need a room. I'll join the company when I'm finished here." Harper grinned. "Yes, sir." Cox's headquarters were dark inside, and Kiersey, Sharp, and Losov waited in an echoing hallway while a sleepy orderly went upstairs. The German officer grinned. "In bed, lucky men." "Major!" Cox was at the top of the stairs, his hair ruffled, dressed in a long red gown belted at his waist. "You're back! A moment! Go into the drawing-rooms! Candles!" Sharp pulled back a heavy velvet curtain, and across the plaza could see the dark shape of the squat cathedral. There was a bustle behind him as Portuguese servants brought in candles and tapers, wine and food, and he let the curtain drop and sat exhausted in a deep, comfortable chair. Down the road, he thought, in the morning. One last effort, one last surprise attack, and it was done. He helped himself to the wine, offered some to Losov, ignored the disapproving look from Kiersey. The door opened. "You helped yourself? Good." Cox had pulled on a shirt and trousers, brushed his hair, and he nodded amicably at Sharp. "Captain? Captain Losov, what can I do for you?" Sharp sat up, surprised. Did Cox not know? He exchanged a glance with Losov. They both looked at Kiersey, expecting him to speak, but the Major sat tight-lipped. Sharp put down his wine. "You know about the gold, sir?" Cox nodded. A shadow on his face hid the expression, but Sharp thought it was guarded. "I know, Captain." "We have it, sir. We must take it to Solorico. We want to defeat the horses, rest, and leave at dawn. With your permission, sir, we'd like the western gate opened an hour before first light." Cox nodded, bent over and poured himself a small glass of wine. "Whose gold is it?" Sharp felt an immense burden come back. "I'm under orders from Lord Wellington, sir, orders to tell me to take the gold to him." Cox's eyebrows shot up. "Good! Well, let me see the orders, then." Sharp glanced at Kiersey, who reddened. The Major cleared his throat. "The orders were accidentally destroyed, sir. No blame to Captain Sharp." Cox's hope seemed to diminish. He peered at Kiersey over his wine. "You saw them? What did they say?" "That all officers should render assistance to Captain Sharp." Kiersey spoke in a neutral voice. Cox nodded. "And Sharp is taking the gold to Lord Wellington, right?" Sharp nodded, but Kiersey interrupted. "The orders did not say, sir." "For God's sake, sir!" Sharp exploded, but Cox banged on the table. "Did your orders specifically mention the gold?" "No, sir." Sharp damned Kiersey for his quibbling honesty. Without the Major's last remark, the light company might be homeward bound in a few hours. Cox's fingers drummed on the table. "I have a problem, gentlemen." He pulled papers towards him, muttered something about tidiness, and held out a thick piece of parchment sealed with a heavy wax circle, and waved it in the candlelight. "A request from the Spanish government, our allies, that the gold does not pass through British hands. Damned strange, really." Losov coughed. "Strange, sir?" Cox nodded. Fellow arrives today, full fig, and tells me about the gold. It was the first I knew about it. He's got an escort for it. Spanish colonel. He's called Jovellanos. Sharp looked at Kiersey. He knew the answer. Jovellanos? El Católico. Kiersey stretched for the piece of paper and held the seal up to the candle before reading the words. It's in order, sir. Genuine. How the hell can it be in order? Sharp's right hand was gripped tight into a fist. He's a bloody bandit, a crook. He wrote the damn thing himself. We have orders, sir, from the General, from Lord Wellington. That gold goes to Salorico. Cox, who had been friendly, scowled at Sharp. I see no need for anger, Captain Sharp. Colonel Jovellanos is here, my guest. But, sir, Losov broke in, glancing at Sharp sympathetically. Captain Sharp speaks the truth. We were told that the gold was important. It had to go to the Lord Wellington. Cox took a deep breath, let it out, tapped his toe on the floor. God damn it, gentlemen, I am facing a siege which will begin any day now. The enemy's guns are in sight, the placements are being dug, and you bring me this. Sharp repeated doggedly. We have orders, sir. Well, so you say. Cox picked up the paper. Is there a junta for Castile? Kiersey nodded. Yes, sir. And does Joachim Jovellanos have authority from it? Kiersey nodded again. And the gold is theirs? The nod again. The paper dropped onto the table. The General gave me no orders. Sharp sighed. An English brigadier in the Portuguese army faced with a Spanish colonel, an English captain, a German cavalryman, Spanish gold, and no orders. He had an idea. Sir, is the telegraph working? Losov snapped his fingers. Cox frowned at the German. Yes, Captain, there's a relay station over the river towards Pinier. When can the first messages be sent? Cox shrugged. Depends on the weather. We are usually an hour after dawn. Sharp nodded impatiently. Would you, sir, consider a message to the General requesting orders concerning the gold? Cox looked at him, shrugged again. Of course. First thing tomorrow? Please, sir. Cox stood up. Good. Problem solved. I'll tell Colonel Jovellanos tomorrow, and you can get a night's sleep. I must say, you look as if you need it. Good God! He was peering at Sharp's shoulder. You're hurt. It will mend, sir. Sharp finished his wine, damned if politeness would stop him. And damn Wellington, too, who had held the cards too close to his chest so that Cox, a decent man, was put in this position. Sir? Cox turned away from the doorway. Sharp? How many men in Colonel Jovellanos' escort? 200, Sharp. God save me, I wouldn't want to meet them in a dark street. Nor I, thought Sharp, nor I. He stood up, waited for the commander of the garrison to leave. Where was El Católico, he wondered? Upstairs asleep? Or watching from a darkened window? Losov at least understood. My men will guard tonight. Sharp smiled his thanks. And tomorrow? The German shrugged, fitted his tall plume busby onto his head. If we cannot leave at dawn, then at dusk, my friend. Cox put his head back round the door. I forgot, remiss of me. You'll stay here, gentlemen. My orderlies can find beds. Kiersey accepted. The two captains pleaded they would rather be with their men, and Cox wished them a good night at the front door, as if he were a host bidding a genial farewell to valued dinner guests. And sleep well. The message goes first thing. Knowles and Harper waited outside, and with them 2 Germans, one of them a barrel of a sergeant who grinned when he was told that the partisans were in the town. Losov looked from his sergeant to Harper. A good match. I'll bet on the Irish. Sharp said the words without offence, and Losov laughed. Home, we sleep. Knowles had done well. Unbarring a huge house that stabled the Germans' horses, housed everyone, and on the second floor, behind a huge polished door, was a bedroom with a feathered mattress, a canopied bed, rugs, and the smell of old wood and fresh sheets. Sharp closed the door, cutting off the sounds of his men, who were sharing wine with the Germans, and looked at the girl. El Católico's here. She nodded. What did you expect? He unbuckled his belt, untied the faded red sash, and he knew that his shoulder was too stiff, too painful for him to undress properly. Teresa saw it, pushed back the sheet, and he saw she was already naked. She crossed the floor, helped him, went back to the huge, soft bed with him. Sharp lay flat, and the girl propped herself beside him. "What does he want?" "Later," Sharp said. "Later." His right arm was still good, and he pulled the girl on top of him, felt her hair fall either side of his face, her hand explore the scars on his back. Her mouth was beside his ear. "Can I keep the rifle?" "It's all yours," he said. "All yours." And it was. Chapter 19. Her finger pressed on the scars of the flogging. "Who did it?" "A man called Morris, and a sergeant, Hakeswill." "Why?" He shrugged. "They lied." "You kill them?" "Not yet." She nodded slowly. "You will?" "I will." It was not yet dawn, but the sky had the grey luminance that came before first light, and Sharp wanted to be at the telegraph early. He was reluctant to move, to lose the warm body, but others were stirring in the house, and a cockerel, exploding into sound in the courtyard, jerked him upright. He lay back again, taking 5 more minutes, and pulled Theresa close. "Did Hardy want you?" She smiled, said something in Spanish, and he assumed she was asking if he was jealous. "No." She wagged her head, seemed to shrug. "Yes, he wanted me." "And did you?" She laughed. "No, Joachim was too close." Joachim, damned Joachim Jovellanos, El Cattolico, colonel and crook. The girl had told him, when they were lying hot and sweaty in the wide bed, of her father, of El Cattolico, of the business of staying alive in the mountains when the enemy is everywhere and there's no law and no government. Her father, she said, was good, but weak. Weak? Sharp had winced as he propped himself on an elbow. He was strong. Theresa still had problems with English, and she shrugged helplessly. Sharp helped her. "And El Cattolico?" She smiled, pushed hair away from her eyes. "He wants everything. My father's men, land, money, me. He's strong." Somewhere a door scraped on old hinges. Boots crossed a yard, and Sharp knew it was time to be up. "And you?" Her hand felt his scars. "We will fight, Ramon, me, father. Joachim only thinks of what happens afterwards." "Afterwards? When there is peace." "And you?" Her hair had the smell of a woman, and his hand rested on the long, muscled waist. "I want to kill Frenchmen." "You will." "I know." Now, looking at the sudden smile, he wished that she was not going. He could, he decided, be happy with this woman. But he laughed inside as he remembered he had thought the same of Josephina. "What are you smiling for?" "Nothing." He swung his legs out of bed, pulled up his crumpled clothes and put them on the bed. She pulled the jacket towards her, opened the pocket. "What's this?" A silver locket lay in her hand. "A locket." She hit him. "I know." She opened it, and inside saw the gold-haired girl with the generous mouth. "Who's that?" "Jealous?" She seemed to understand and laughed. "Who is she?" "Jane Gibbons." She imitated him. "Jane Gibbons. Who is she? Is she waiting for you?" "No. I've never met her." She looked at the face in the miniature painting. "She's pretty." "Never?" "Never." "Why do you have it?" "I knew her brother." "Ah." Friendship made sense to her. "Is he dead?" "Yes." "The French?" She said the word with her customary spite. "No." She looked exasperated at his answers. "Was he a soldier?" "Yes." "Then how did he die?" Sharp pulled on the French overalls. "I killed him." "You?" Sharp paused. "No. The sergeant killed him. I killed the other one." "What other one?" She sat up, flinched as he pulled back the curtain. Across the street was a church with ornate stonework and a laddered bell tower. The soldier in Sharp automatically understood that the church roof must have a platform for the ladder, a possible firing position. They were enemies. They hurt a friend. She understood the half-truth. A woman? He nodded. Not mine. Another half-truth. But by the time the two lieutenants had died, Josephina had already found Hardy. She laughed. You're a good man, Richard. I know. He grinned at her, picked up the locket and pushed it back into his pocket. Why had he kept it? Because Gibbon's sister was so beautiful? Or was it now his talisman, his magic charm against the killing lance and El Catolico's rapier? Teresa helped him with the jacket buttons. You'll come back. I'll be back. The soldiers are here. You're safe. She leant off the bed, pulled up the rifle. I'm safe. He left her in the bedroom, feeling his loss, and went down to where the kitchen fire was blazing, and Losov was drinking beer from an earthenware bottle. The German captain grinned at Sharp. Good night, my friend. Knowles winced. Harper looked to the ceiling, but Sharp growled something approximately polite and crossed to the fire. Tea? Here, sir. Harper pushed a mug over the table. Just wet it. A dozen men of the company were in the kitchen, and some Germans, and they were sawing with knives at the new bread, and looking surprised because there were pots of butter, fresh butter, on the table. Sharp scraped his boot on the hearth, and his men looked up. The girl— he wondered if he sounded embarrassed, but the men seemed not to mind. Look after her till I get back. They nodded, grinned at him, and he was suddenly immensely proud of them. She'd be safe with them, scoundrels though they were, just as a king's ransoming gull was safe with them. He'd never thought of it, not in detail, but it occurred to Sharp that most officers would never have trusted their men with the gold. They would have feared desertion, that the temptation of so much money would be simply too much. But Sharp had never been worried. These were his men, his company, and he trusted his life with their skills, so why not gold, or a girl? Robert Knowles cleared his throat. When will you be back, sir? 3 hours. An hour till the message could be sent, an hour for the reply to come, and then another hour unpicking the details with Cox. Keep an eye out for El Catolico. He's here. Keep a guard, Robert, all the time, and don't let anyone in. No one. The men grinned at him, laughed as they thought what they could do to anyone who interfered with them, and Losov clapped his hands together. We surprised the Spanish, yes? They think they have the gold, but they don't know about the telegraph. Ha! The wonders of modern war! It was cold in the street, the sky still dark grey, but as Sharp, Losov and Harper mounted the final steps to the rampart of the castle, they could see the eastern sky blazing with the coming sun. The telegraph was unmanned, the sheep ladders tied to the mast, and in the cruel grey light it reminded Sharp of a gallows. The wind slapped the ropes in a forlorn tattoo against the mast. The sun shattered the remnants of night, dazzled over the eastern hills, and streaked its bleak, early light into the countryside round Almeida. As if in salute, there was a blare of bugles, shouts from the walls, and Losov clapped Sharp's good shoulder and pointed south. Look! The bugles had responded to the first formal move of the siege. The waiting was over, and through his undamaged telescope, Sharp saw that the dawn light had revealed a mound of fresh earth that had been thrown up 1,000 yards from the fortifications. It was the first French battery, and even as Sharp watched, he saw the tiny figures of men throwing up more earth and battening great fascines to the crest of the mound. It had been years since he had carried a fascine to war, a great wicker cylinder that was filled with soil and provided an instant battlement to protect men and guns from enemy artillery. The Portuguese gunners had seen the fresh earthworks and were running along the town wall. Losov pounded his fist on the ramparts. "Fire, you bastards!" A Portuguese gun team on the town defences seemed to hear him, for there was the flat crack of a cannon, and through the glass Sharp saw an eruption of earth where the round shot struck the ground just in front of the French battery. The ball must have bounced right over the top, and he knew the Portuguese gunners would be satisfied. After another 2 firings their gun barrel would be hot, and the shot would carry further, and he listened for the next shot, saw it fall a little beyond the first, and watched as the French soldiers hurried to take cover. "Next one!" He let the telescope lie where it was and straightened up. Over the roofs of the town he could see the smoke of the cannon drifting in the breeze, saw another smudge as the Portuguese fired again, and then, a second later, heard the crash and watched the fascines blow apart. "Bravo!" Losov clapped his hands. "That's held them up for 5 minutes." Sharp picked up the telescope and panned it to the south. There were few Frenchmen visible, the new battery and encampment half a mile beyond that, and a few figures on horseback riding the circuit well beyond the range of the defenders' guns. The close siege hadn't started yet. The careful digging of the zigzag trenches that would bring the infantry to striking distance of the breach that the French would hope to blast through the walls with battery after battery of huge iron siege guns. And all the time the howitzers, untouchable in their deep pits, would lob their bombs into the town day after day. He looked westward to the road that led to the Coa, and beyond one earthen barricade there was no real attempt by the French to seal it off. That would come in a day or two, when the siege proper began, and he handed the glass to Losov. "We can do it." The German looked at the road, smiled. "It will be a pleasure." There were footsteps on the circular stone stairway, and the young midshipman, holding a thick sandwich, emerged onto the ramparts, and looked startled to see the waiting men. He put his sandwich in his mouth, saluted, rescued his sandwich. "Morning, sir." He put down the pile of books he was carrying in his other hand. "Morning." Sharp guessed the boy was no older than 15. "When do you start sending?" "When the messages get here, sir." Sharp pointed to the books. "What's that?" "Lessons, sir. Principles of navigation. I've got to pass the exam soon, sir, even though I'm not at sea." "You should join the Rifles, lad." Harper picked up the book. "We don't stuff your head with mathematics." Sharp looked westwards. "Where's the relay station?" The boy pointed northwest. "Between the two hills, sir. It's over the river on a church." Sharp pointed the glass, held it steady by jamming it next to the telegraph's mast, and far away, like a speck of dust, he could see the tiny telegraph station. "How the hell do you read it?" "With this, sir." The boy unlocked a trunk that was part of the mast's foundation, and dragged out an iron tripod that carried a telescope twice the size of Sharp's. Losov laughed. "Thank you, Captain," Sharp said dryly. He liked Losov, but was not sure about the man's sense of humour. Harper seemed to enjoy it.
End of Disc 6. Disc 7.
In the plaza in front of the cathedral, Sharp watched the foreshortened shapes of two officers walking towards the castle. "Are those your messages?" The midshipman leant over. "Yes, sir. Captain Charles usually brings them." As Sharp watched, he saw 3 men rolling a keg of powder from the cathedral across the plaza and towards the warren of streets. He guessed that the guns on the wall kept very little ready powder, fearing a spark, and an explosion that would save the French weeks of work, and the soldiers would be busy taking the black powder from the cathedral and delivering it to the gunners who sweated on the defences. He was glad he would not be here for the siege, for the helpless feeling of watching the earthworks creep closer, the siege guns firing slowly but with massive hammering force. "Good morning, you must be Sharp." Captain Charles, a Portuguese officer beside him, sounded cheerful. He looked at the midshipman. "Morning, Jeremy. Sleep well?" "Yes, sir." The midshipman had put up the telescope and trained it on the far mast. "Hold on, sir." He looked through the glass for a second, then leapt to the mast, untied the bladder ropes, and hauled on them one at a time, so that the black bag shot up to the pulley at the cross-trees and fell down again. "What was that?" Sharp asked. "Just saying good morning, sir." The midshipman left 3 bladders down, the other raised. "That says we're transmitting, sir," he added helpfully. Sharp looked through the big telescope. The far tower, much closer now, had 2 black dots level and halfway up the mast, presumably the signal that said they were ready to receive a message. "Here you are, Jeremy." Charles handed over the first sheet, and the boy leapt to the ropes, tugged and dropped them, sometimes looking at the sheet Captain Charles had given him, but mostly doing it from memory. Cox's staff captain jerked a thumb at the midshipman. "Busy little blighter, eh? Used to be 2 of them, but the other got the pox, died on us." Sharp looked over the midshipman's shoulder at the sheet of paper and read 48726 91858 38197. "Code!" Captain Charles boomed at him. "Jolly clever, yes?" "What does it say?" The staff captain, gold lace at his cuffs, touched his nose. "Can't say, dear chap. Top secret. Probably says the brigadier has run out of rum. Please send supply. Urgent. Something like that." "Isn't that the gold message?" "Gold? Don't know about that. Only 3 messages this morning. That one tells the general that the 68th Regiment of the line are outside since yesterday. This one's the daily report on available shot, and the last one's about the French battery." "Christ almighty!" Sharp started towards the stairs, but Lossow touched his arm. "I'll go." The German was serious. "You stay." Harper stood beside Lossow. "You should stay here, sir. You don't know what the Spanish are up to." Lossow smiled. "You see? Outvoted." He ran down the stairs, and Sharp turned back to Captain Charles. "What the hell's happening at headquarters?" Charles sniffed, handed the second piece of paper to the midshipman. "Affairs of state, I don't know. Your major, the Spanish colonel, and it's all arm-waving and table-thumping. Not my style, dear boy. Oh, I say, that is clever." He was staring to the south. Sharp turned, picked up the telescope, and trained it on the French battery. Nothing was happening. The fascines still lay splayed apart and split open, and there were not even men attempting to repair the damage. "What is it?" he asked. "Over there." Charles was pointing further to the right. "A second battery hidden. We bang away at a heap of earth, and the clever devils sneak the real battery into place. Jolly clever." It was clever. Sharp saw French soldiers dragging away branches that had cloaked the excavation of a battery that, judging from the activity around it, was ready to open fire. He could see how well protected it was, by yards of earth, mounted fascines, and trenches for the gunners to use when under fire. The siege gun, hidden by shadows, could harass the defenders' guns as the French built their works forward until the breaching batteries were in place, and the two forces, attackers and defenders, got down to work in earnest. The battery was built on the edge of dead ground, and Sharp knew that there would be infantry there, well protected from the Portuguese batteries, ready to repel an attack on the harassing battery. Charles rubbed his hands. "Things will hot up soon. They've been slow." Harper looked at the elegant captain. "How long can you hold out, sir?" Captain Charles beamed at him. "Forever, Sergeant, or at least as long as the ammunition lasts. Once that's gone, we'll just have to throw rocks." That was evidently a joke, for he laughed. "But there are tons of powder in the cathedral, and the Portuguese are good. By Jove, they're good." Sharp stared at the new battery, and as he looked he saw a cloud of smoke grow at an incredible speed just in front of the earthwork. The smoke was lanced with red flame and hardly visible, more of an impression than something he really saw. There was a pencil trace in the sky. He knew what it was, the sight of the shot arcing directly towards them. "Down! What is it?" Charles looked at him, but as he did the castle literally shook. The stones of the huge keep seemed to waver and crack, and mixed with the reverberating crash of falling masonry came the thunder of the siege gun. "Good Lord!" Charles was still standing. "Good Lord above! A ranging shot!" Sharp leant over the ramparts. Some stones had fallen into the moat, dust hung in the air, and frightened birds nesting in the crevices flew out into the startled air. "Bloody good shooting!" Harper growled. The sound of the replying batteries was thinner than that of the giant gun, but more frequent. It took a long time to reload a siege gun. Sharp, through the telescope, watched as the smoke of the discharge cleared, and the Portuguese balls crashed into the redoubt, but to no apparent damage. The hard-packed earth soaked up the cannonade, and the aperture, just wide enough for its purpose, was plugged with fascines as the artilleryman sponged out and rammed home the huge missile. He kept watching, saw the fascines pulled back. "Here it comes!" This time he kept his eyes in the air, above the gun, and saw the pencil line clearly as the huge iron ball rose and fell in its flat trajectory. "For what we're about to receive," Charles said, and the tower shook again, less violently, and the crash and the rumble mixed with the dust and the squawking birds. Charles brushed at his immaculate uniform. "Distinctly unfriendly." "Has it occurred to you that they're after the telegraph?" Sharp said. "Good Lord, you could be right." He turned to the midshipman.
Hurry along, sailor!
A shout from the stairway and Losov appeared, covered in dust, grinning and holding a piece of paper.
The message!
Sharp grabbed the boy. Stop everything, send that.
But, sir...
The midshipman saw Sharp's face, decided not to argue.
Hurry!
Captain Charles looked annoyed, but reluctant to interfere, and watched as the boy clattered the ropes up and down.
I'm just cancelling the last message, sir, and then I'll send yours.
Another shot boomed overhead, sounding like a giant barrel being rolled fast across floorboards. It left a wind behind it, hot and violent, and Harper glanced at Sharp and raised his eyebrows. Losov looked at the battery, at the rolling cloud of dirty smoke, and pursed his lips.
They've got the range.
The boy's doing his best, Sharp said irritably.
What was the delay?
Damned politics. Losov spread his hands.
The Spanish insisted on a message saying that the gold was Spanish. They insisted on protesting that they did not want British help. Cox is angry, Kiersey is saying his prayers, and your Spanish friends are sharpening their swords. Ah, at last.
The black, tarred sheep ladders leapt up on the ropes, quivered for a second, and fell. The boy danced between the halyards, hauling away number by number, the obscene black bags vibrating in the breeze as they jerked up and down.
Sir!
Harper's watching the battery.
Sir! Down!
The ball, 24 pounds of iron, struck only a glancing blow on one of the crosstrees. The telegraph was well made, jointed and bolted, and as the French ball spun off into the unknown, it ripped itself completely from its base like a tree torn bodily by a hurricane. The boy, holding on to a rope, was spun into the air, screaming until another halyard whiplashed round his neck and tore his head horribly from his shoulders. His blood sprayed the four men falling backwards, and then the mast, still unbroken, pounded back onto the ramparts, killing Charles instantly, broke itself in a great fracture, bounced like a falling cane, and stopped still.
Sweet Jesus!
Harper stood up.
Are you all right, sir?
Yes. Sharp's shoulder hurt like the devil.
Where's the boy?
The sergeant pointed to the head.
Rest of him's over the wall, sir. Poor wee thing.
Losov swore in German, stood up, flinched as he put his weight on his left leg. Sharp looked at him.
Are you hurt?
Just a bruise. Losov saw the midshipman's head.
Good God!
He knelt by Charles, felt for a pulse, and opened one of the captain's eyelids.
Dead, poor fellow.
Harper looked over the ramparts at the drifting smoke.
Just 4 shots, that's good shooting.
There was a reluctant respect in his voice. Losov stood up, wiped blood from his hands.
We must get out of here.
Sharp turned to him. We must persuade Cox to let us out.
Yeah, not easy, my friend.
Harper kicked the fallen beam.
Perhaps they can rig another telegraph, sir.
Sharp shrugged.
And who works it?
Maybe. I don't know. He glanced at the battery, its embrasure plugged, and he knew that the French gunners would be celebrating. They deserved it. He doubted if the gun would fire again. Not today. The iron barrels had a limited life, and the gun had achieved its purpose. Come on, let's see Cox.
You don't sound hopeful, my friend.
Sharp turned round, blood flecking his uniform, and his face grim. We'll get out. With or without him, we'll get out. Chapter 20. Light, like carved silver, slashed the cathedral's gloom, slanted across the crouching grey pillars, splintered off brass and paint, drowned the votive candles that burned before the statues, inched its way over the broad, worn flagstones as the sun moved higher, and Sharp waited. A priest, lost in the depths of the choir, mumbled beyond the window light, and Sharp saw Harper cross himself. What day is it?
Sunday, sir.
Is that Mass?
Yes, sir.
You want to go?
That'll wait.
Losov's heels clicked in the side aisle. He came from behind a pillar, blinked in the sunlight.
Where is he?
He disappeared again. Christ, thought Sharp. Christ and 1,000 deaths. Damn the bloody French, damn the bloody gunner. And he might as well have stayed in the warm bed with his arms round the girl. Footsteps sounded in the doorway, and he swivelled anxiously. But it was only a squad of bare-headed Portuguese soldiers, muskets slung, who dipped their fingers in the holy water and clattered up the aisle to the priest and his service. Cox had not been at his headquarters. He was on the ramparts, they were told. So the three had hurried there, and Cox had gone. Now he was said to be visiting the magazine, so they waited, and the light shaped the dust into silver bars, and the muffled responses got lost somewhere in the high stone ceiling, and still Cox had not arrived. Sharp slammed his scabbard on the floor, hurting his shoulder, so he cursed again. "Amen to that, sir." Harper had infinitely more patience. Sharp felt ashamed. This was Harper's religion. "I'm sorry." The Irishman grinned. "Wouldn't worry, sir. It doesn't offend me, and if it offends him, then he's plenty of opportunity to punish you." "I'm in love with her," Sharp thought. God damn and blasted. And if they were delayed another night, that would mean another night. And if it were a week, another week. But they had to move, and soon, for within 2 days the French would tie Almeida in a ring of earthworks and infantry. But leaving Almeida meant leaving her. And he hacked down again with a scabbard so that Losov reappeared. "What is it?" "Nothing." Just one more night, he thought. And he lifted his eyes up to the huge rood that hung in the grey shadows. Is that so much to ask? Just one more night, and we can leave at dawn tomorrow. Dawn is the time to say goodbye, not dusk. And just one more night? There was the creak of the cathedral door, the rattle of heels, and Cox came in with a crowd of officers. Sharp stood up. "Sir!" Cox appeared not to hear him, and headed straight over the floor towards the crypt steps, the chatter of his officers smothering the muted drone of the Mass at the far end of the cathedral. "Losov!" Sharp called. "Come on!" Portuguese soldiers stopped them at the top of the steps, and stood silently as they pulled felt slippers over their boots. Sharp fumbled with the drawstrings, his left arm stiff. But then the slippers were on, and the three men, their heels protected against sparking on stone, went down into the crypt. The light was dim, and only a handful of lanterns, their hornpanes dulling the candle flames, flickered on block-like tombs. There was no sign of Cox or his officers, but at the far end a leather curtain swayed in a doorway. "Come on." Sharp led them to the curtain, forced its stiff weight aside, and gasped. "Good God!" Losov paused at the head of a short flight of steps that dropped into a dark cavern. "Good God!" The lower crypt was jammed with barrels, piled to the low arched ceiling, row after row of them, reaching back into a gloom that was relieved only by an occasional horn lantern, double-shielded. And to right and left were further aisles, and when Sharp turned, at the foot of the stairs he saw that the steps came down in the middle of the room, and the gigantic quantity of powder in front was mirrored behind. He whistled softly. "This way." Cox had disappeared down the aisle, and they hurried after, looking at the rotund barrels above them, awed by the sheer destructive power of the gunpowder that had been stacked in the deep vault. Captain Charles, before he died, had said that Almeida could last as long as its powder, and that could be months, Sharp thought. And then he tried to imagine a French shell smashing through the stonework and sparking the barrels. It couldn't happen. The floors were too thick. But all the same he looked up and was glad to see the broad buttresses, hugely strong, that arched beneath a floor that could have resisted 1,000 French shells, and then still be strong. Cox was at the very end of the vault, listening to a Portuguese officer, and the conversation was urgent. It was part in Portuguese, part in English, and Sharp could hear enough to understand the problem. Water was seeping into the crypt. Not much, but enough to have soaked 2 bales of musket ammunition that were stored there. Cox swung round. "Who put it here?" There was silence. "We must move it." He dropped into Portuguese, then saw Sharp. "Captain!" "Sir?" "In my headquarters. Wait for me there." "Sir," Cox whirled angrily. "I have enough problems, Sharp. Damned ammunition stored in the wrong place. It shouldn't be here anyway. Put it upstairs." He went back into Portuguese, waved his arms, pointed upstairs. Harper touched Sharp's elbow. "Come on, sir." Sharp turned, but Cox called him again. "Captain!" "Sir?" "Where's the gold?" The faces of the Portuguese officers seemed to be accusing Sharp. "In our quarters, sir." "Wrong place, Sharp, wrong place. I'll send men, and it'll be put in my headquarters." "Sir!" But Losov grabbed him, took him away, and Cox turned back to the damp walls and the problem of moving thousands of rounds of musket cartridges up to the cathedral floor. Sharp resisted the German's pull. "I will not give up the gold." I know. Listen, my friend, you go to the headquarters, and I will go back. I promise you no one will touch the gold, no one." Lossov's face was deep in shadow, but by the tone of his voice Sharp knew the gold was safe. He turned to Harper. "Go with him. On my orders, no one, but no one, is to go near that gold. You understand?" "Yes, sir. You'll be, careful in the street." "They're full of soldiers. I'll be fine. Now go." The two went ahead. Sharp called after them. "Patrick?" "Sir?" "Look after the girl." The big Irishman nodded. "You know I will, sir." The cathedral bells reverberated with noon. The sun was almost directly overhead, and Sharp walked slowly across the main plaza behind two men pushing a barrel of gunpowder. The big French gun, as he had thought, had done its job and was silent, but out there beyond the spreading ramparts and beyond the killing ground, the French would be digging their trenches, making new batteries, and the oxen would be hauling the giant guns towards the siege. Almeida was about to become the war, the point of effort, and when it fell, there was nothing between Massena and the sea, except the gold. And suddenly Sharp stopped, utterly still, and stared at the Portuguese soldiers who came and went by the cathedral. The gold, Hogan had said, was more important than men or horses. The general, Sharp remembered, had spoken of delaying the enemy, bringing him to battle, but none of that effort would save Portugal. Only the gold. He looked at the castle with its granite masonry, and the stump of the telegraph jutting a brief shadow over the battlement, and then at the cathedral with its carved saints. And despite the sun, the blistering heat, he felt cold. Was it more important than this, than a town and its defenders? Out there, beyond the houses, were all the paraphernalia of a scientific defence. The great grey defences of this town, the star shape of glacis and covered way, of town ditch and counterguard, of bastion and battery. And he shivered. He was not afraid of decisions. They were his job, and he despised men who feared to make them. But in the sudden moment, in the middle of the great plaza, he felt the fear. He waited through the long afternoon, listening to the bells of Sunday, the last peaceful day Almeida would know in a long time, and still Cox did not come. Once he heard a Portuguese battery open fire, but there was no reply, and the town slumbered again, waiting for its moment. The door opened, and Sharp, half asleep in the big chair, started to his feet. Therese's father stood there with half a smile. He closed the door silently. "She was never harmed?" "No." The man laughed. "You are clever." "She was clever." Cesar Moreno nodded. "She is, like her mother." He sounded sad, and Sharp felt sorrow for him. The man looked up. "Why did she side with you?" Sharp shook his head. "She didn't. She's against the French." "Ah, the passion of youth." He came nearer, walking slowly. "I hear your men won't release the gold." Sharp shrugged, and the Spaniard followed the gesture with a smile. "Do you despise me?" "No." "I'm an old man, given sudden power. I'm not like Sanchez." He stopped, thinking about the great partisan of Castile. "He's young, he loves it all. I just want peace." He smiled, as if embarrassed by the words. "Can you buy it?" "What a foolish question. Of course! We haven't given up, you know." "We?" "El Católico and I." He shrugged, traced a finger through the dust on the table. It occurred to Sharp that El Católico may not have given up, but Cesar Moreno, the widower and father, was making sure he had supporters on both sides. The old man looked at him. "Did you sleep with her?" "Yes." He smiled again, a little ruefully, and wiped the dust off his hand. "Many men would envy you." Sharp made no reply, and Moreno looked at him fiercely. "She'll not come to any harm, will she?" It was not a question. He knew. "Not from me."
"Ah. Work carefully, Captain Sharp. He's better with his sword than you. I will walk carefully.
The Spaniard turned, looked at the varnished pictures on the wall that told of happier times, plumper days, and said quietly,
He won't let you take the gold. You know that?
He?
Brigadier Cox.
I didn't know. Moreno turned back.
It is a pleasure to watch you, Captain. We all knew Kiersey was a fool. A pleasant fool, but not what you say... movement. In the head?
I know what you mean.
Then you came, and we thought the English had sent a strong fool after an intelligent fool. You fooled us.
He laughed. It was difficult to make jokes in a strange language.
No, he won't let you. Cox is an honorable man, like Kiersey, and they know the gold is ours. How will you beat that, friend?
Watch me. Sharp smiled.
I will. And my daughter?
She'll come back to you, very soon.
And that makes you sad.
Sharp nodded, and Moreno gave Sharp a shrewd look that reminded the rifleman that once this man had been powerful. Could be again. Moreno's voice was gentle.
Perhaps one day.
But you hope not. Teresa's father nodded and smiled.
I hope not, but she is headstrong. I watched her from the day I betrothed her to El Católico. I knew one day she would spit in my face, and his. She waited her moment like you.
And now he waits his?
Yes. Go carefully.
He went to the door, waved a hand.
We will meet again.
Sharp sat down, poured a glass of wine, and shook his head. He was tired to the bone, and his shoulder ached, and he wondered if his left arm would ever move free again. And the shadows lengthened on the carpet till he slept, not hearing the evening gun or the door opening. "Sharp! God almighty!" He jerked upright. "Sir?" Cox strode over the floor, trailing staff officers and paper. "What the devil's happening, Sharp?" "Happening, sir? Your men won't release the gold." Kiersey came through the door, and with him, magnificently uniformed, a Spanish colonel. It took Sharp a few seconds of focusing on the gold lace, the looping silver, to realize it was El Católico. The face had not changed. The powerful eyes, the slight glint of humour, the face of an enemy. He turned back to Cox. "I'm sorry, sir." "Are you deaf, Sharp? The gold, where is it?" "Don't know, sir." "Waited here, sir, as ordered, sir." Cox grunted, picked up a piece of paper, looked at it, and let it drop. "I've made a decision." "Yes, sir. A decision, sir." Sharp had adopted his erstwhile sergeant's manner, always useful when faced by senior officers, and especially useful when he wanted to think of other things than the immediate conversation. Cox glanced up suspiciously. "I'm sorry, Sharp, I only have your word for it, and Losov's. The gold is Spanish, obviously Spanish, and Colonel Jovellanos is an accredited representative of the government of Spain." He gestured at El Católico, who smiled and bowed. Sharp looked at the partisan leader in his immaculate finery. "Yes, sir. Accredited representative, sir." The bastard must be handy with a pen, he thought, and it suddenly occurred to him that one of the fat coins would make a superb seal, pressed into the red wax with the ornate coat of arms downwards. He wondered how El Católico had obliterated the writing round the edge of the coin, but then thought how he would do it himself with a file, or by hammering the soft gold flat. Cox sighed. "You will deliver the gold to Colonel Jovellanos and his men, and you will do it quickly. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir, understood." He was standing ramrod straight, staring at a point just above Cox's head. The brigadier sighed. "I don't think it is, Captain." Cox sat down wearily, pulled a sheet of paper towards him, uncapped his ink, and took a fresh goose-quill. "At 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Captain. 27th August, 1810. He was writing quickly, paraphrasing the formal order, as the quill scratched on the paper. "A detachment of my troops will take charge of the bullion." He paused. The room listened to the scrape of the pen. "Led by—" Cox looked round the room, found one of his officers. "Colonel Barrios, Barrios nodded, a formal gesture. "You, Colonel, will deliver the gold to Colonel Jovellanos, who will be ready to leave at the north gate." El Católico nodded, clicked his heels for attention. Cox looked up. "Colonel?" El Católico smiled. His voice was at its silkiest.
"I was hoping to persuade you, sir, to allow myself and some of my men to stay and help in your gallant defence."
Sharp could not believe it. The bastard! He had as much intention of staying as Sharp had of handing over the gold. Cox smiled, blinked with pleasure. "Well, that's uncommonly decent of you, Colonel." He gestured at the paper. "Does it change anything?"
"Only that the gold, sir, could be handed to Senor Moreno, or one of my lieutenants."
Of course, of course." Cox dipped the quill, scratched out some words. "To the Spanish contingent of Colonel Jovellanos." He raised an eyebrow to El Católico. "I think that covers it." El Católico bowed.
"Thank you, sir."
He shot a look of triumph at Sharp.
"And, sir,"
El Católico bowed again,
"could the transfer be tonight?"
Sharp held his breath, let it out slowly as Cox spoke. The brigadier was frowning, looking at the paper. 10 o'clock will do, Colonel." Sharp suspected he didn't want to cross out the top lines of the closely written order. Cox smiled at El Católico, gestured at Sharp. "After all, Captain Sharp can hardly leave." El Católico smiled politely.
"As you say, sir."
So what was the bastard playing at? Why the suggestion that he might stay on? Sharp stared at the tall Spaniard, trying to fathom the motive. Could it be just to curry favour with Cox? Sharp doubted it. The Spaniard was getting most of what he wanted without trying, except that El Católico did want one thing more. Sharp thought of the dark hair on the pillow, the slim body on the stiff white linen sheets. The Spaniard wanted the girl, and his revenge. And if it could not be tonight, then El Católico would stay on till it was accomplished. Sharp was suddenly aware that Cox had spoken his name. "Sir?" The brigadier had pulled another sheet of paper forward. "At 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Captain, your company will join my defences on the south wall." The pen spattered ink on the paper. "Pardon, sir?" Cox looked up from the paper, irritated. "You heard me, Sharp. You join the garrison. Captain Lossow leaves. I don't need cavalry, but you stay. No infantry can hope to escape now, understand?" God in heaven! "Yes, sir." The cathedral clock began chiming. Kearsey put a hand on Sharp's elbow. "I'm sorry, Sharp." Sharp nodded, listening to the bell. He was oblivious of Kearsey's concern, of El Católico's triumph, of Cox's preoccupation. 10 o'clock, and all not well. The decision had been forced on him, but it was still his decision. The last echo of the last note died flatly away, and Sharp wondered if any bell would ever ring ever again in the grey-starred, ill-starred fortress town. Chapter 21. "We're stuck. That's the problem. We're stuck."
Pardon, sir?"
Sergeant Harper was waiting for Sharp outside Cox's headquarters. "Nothing." Sharp stood there, conscious of Patrick Harper's worried look. The sergeant probably thought that his wound was going bad, poisoning the blood and sending insane vapours into his head. "Are you alone?"
No, sir. Private Roach, Daniel Hagman, and 3 Germans."
Sharp saw the others waiting in the shadows. The small, squat German sergeant was there, and Harper jerked a thumb at him.
"That's Helmut, sir."
"You mean Helmut?"
"That's what I said, sir. He's a one-man army. Are you all right, sir?"
"Yes." Sharp still stood on the steps, his escort waiting below, and fingered a piece of his sword's silver wire hilt wrapping that had worked itself loose. He made a mental note to have it soldered flat when they were back with the battalion, and then marvelled that the mind could dwell on such a triviality at a moment like this. Harper coughed.
"Are you ready, sir?"
"What?" "Yes." He still did not move. He stared at the cathedral. Patrick Harper tried again.
"Home, sir?"
"No." Over there." He pointed at the cathedral.
"Yes, sir. Anything you say, sir."
They walked across the plaza lit by the moon, and Sharp pulled his thoughts back to the present. "Is the girl all right?" Harper nodded.
"Lovely, sir. She's fought all day."
"Fought?" The Irishman grinned.
"Helmet taught her how to use the sabre."
Sharp laughed. It sounded like Teresa. He looked at the small German sergeant and smiled at the man's curious walk, the legs bent apart like a lyre frame, the stocky, immensely strong body scarcely moving as the legs pushed it forward. Harper saw Sharp's change of mood.
"We reckon you could just point Helmet at anything, sir, and he'd chew his way through. Houses, walls, regiments, they'd all have a wee hole just his shape straight through them."
Harper laughed.
"Bloody good with a sabre."
Sharp thought of the girl, knew that El Cattolico had another score to settle, more personal than the gold, and was glad of his escort, of Harper with his 7-barrel gun. "What happened at the house today?" Harper laughed.
"Oh, not a lot, sir. They turned up for the gold, so they did. And first we couldn't speak the Portuguese, and then Mr. Lossoff couldn't understand their English, and then Helmet growled a bit, chewed up some furniture, and the lads put on their spikes, and the Portuguese went home."
"Where's the girl now?"
"Still there, sir."
Harper grinned at him reassuringly.
"Down in the kitchen with the lads, having her weapons training. She'd make a good recruit."
"And Mr. Knowles?"
"Enjoying himself, sir. All-round defence, sir. And keep your eyes open, and Mr. Knowles doing the rounds every 10 minutes. They won't get in. What's happening to us, sir?"
Sharp shrugged, looked up at the dark windows of the houses. "We're supposed to hand the gold over tomorrow, to El Cattolico."
"And are we, sir?"
"What do you think?" Harper grinned, said nothing. And then one of the Germans crouched, sabre held up, and the group stopped. One of the few Portuguese civilians left in the town, hurrying from an alleyway, shrank into the wall and babbled incoherently at the odd group of soldiers who bristled with swords and guns and were looking at him as if sizing him for slaughter. "All right," Sharp said. "On we go." By the cathedral doors, Sharp could see the dark shapes of sentries guarding the ammunition. He crossed to them, his escort's heels echoing over the vast stone square, and the Portuguese guards snapped to attention, saluted, as Sharp turned to the 3 Germans. "Stay here." Helmut nodded. "Hagman, Roach, stay with them. Come on, Sergeant." He stared over the plaza before opening the small door that pierced the huge wooden gate into the cathedral. Was there a dark shape on the far side, hovering by a corner of an alleyway? He suspected the partisans were scouting the town, looking for him, but nothing would happen till they reached the dark warren of streets down the hill. He went inside. The candles had come into their own, throwing small, wavering pools of yellow light on patches of the great stone vault. The tiny red glow of the eternal presence flickered at the far end, and Sharp waited while Harper dipped a casual finger and crossed himself. The Irishman stepped alongside Sharp.
"What are we doing, sir?"
"I don't know." Sharp chewed his bottom lip, stared at the small lights, then walked towards the cluster of lanterns that marked the steps to the vault. More sentries stiffened as they approached, and Sharp waved them down. "Slippers, Sergeant." There was a small pile of ammunition by the head of the steps, put there for the soldiers who came to fetch it for the ramparts, to save them the bother of pulling on the felt slippers. Sharp guessed that about 20 men would work the magazine, bringing up the barrels, living their days in the damp, cold air of the cathedral's underworld. Harper saw Sharp staring at an open bale of cartridges.
"There's more by the door, sir." "More?"
Harper nodded, pointed at a door that flanked the great processional gates.
"There, sir. Bloody great pile of cartridges. Did you want some?"
Sharp shook his head, peered into the gloom, and saw that against the door there were a dozen bales of the paper cartridges. He guessed they were placed so that infantry battalions could replenish swiftly without getting in the way of the men who brought up the huge powder kegs. He turned back to the crypt. Planks had been laid down the stairs, 2 feet apart, so that the barrels could be rolled up easily. "Come on." They went down the stairs, into the intermittent light of the horn lanterns, and Sharp saw that the rest of the garrison's supply of small arms ammunition was now stacked either side of the vault, forming a corridor to the leather-curtained steps of the deep crypt. He padded down the corridor and knelt by the curtain. 2 thicknesses of stiff leather waited at the bottom, a precaution in case there was a small explosion in the first vault. The stiff leather could soak up a minor blast, protect the massive dump of gunpowder beneath. And Harper watched, astonished, as Sharp drew his sword and cut off the weights, clenching his teeth as he sawed through the leather. "What the hell, sir?" Sharp looked up at him. "Don't ask. Where are the sentries?" "Upstairs." The sergeant knelt beside him. "Sir?" Sharp stopped the desperate cutting, looked at the broad, friendly face. "Don't you trust me?" Harper was offended, even hurt, and he bent past Sharp, took hold of the torn part of the curtain in one hand, the upper leather in the other, and pulled. As a demonstration of strength, it was remarkable. The veins standing out in his neck, his whole body rigid with effort as the double-thick leather peeled apart silently and slowly. And Sharp helped it with the saw blade until, after 30 seconds, Harper leant back with a grunt, and in his hand was the separated bottom 2 inches of the curtain with its heavy lead weight sewn into the hem. "Of course I bloody trust you, just tell me." The Irishman's anger was real. Sharp shook his head. "I will. Later. Come on." Upstairs, taking off the slippers, Sharp nodded at the candles. "Funny keeping them alight." Harper shook his head. "They're a hell of a way from the vault, sir." His voice showed that he was slightly mollified, still insulted, but ready to be friendly. "Anyway, it's what they call insurance, isn't it?" "Insurance? Sure." The huge head nodded. "A few prayers never did any army any harm." He stood up. "Where now, sir?" "To a bakery." The soldiers, British and German, were mystified as Sharp traced a gutter away from the cathedral to a building not far from the north gate. He tried the door, but it was well locked, and Harper gestured him to one side. "Helmet? Door." The German sergeant nodded, moved ponderously at the barrier, grunted as he hit it, and then turned with what passed as a smile as the wood splintered away in front of him. "Told you, sir," Harper said. "Any provosts about?" "If there are any, kill them," Sharp said. "Sir, you hear that, Helmet? Kill the provosts." It was pitch black inside, but Sharp felt his way over the floor, past a table that must once have been the counter for the shop, and found huge brick ovens, cold now, hunched at the back of the bakery. He went back to the street, empty of Portuguese provosts or patrols. They climbed the shallow ramp to the first wall and stopped by the battlements. Sentries lined the rampart, bunched near the gleaming batteries that had been dug into the wall's heart, and in front of them, crouched like grey fingers, were the outer defences, gently sloping, deceptive, filled with Portuguese troops whose fires cast strange glows on the deep ditches that were unseen by the enemy. Further out, beyond the dark strip of earth that was cleared of cover so that the defenders could tear the heart out of an assault, Sharp could see French fires, some half hidden, and from the far darkness came the occasional ring of a pickaxe, the thump of earth being pried loose. He jumped, startled by a sudden report, and realized that the Portuguese were sending the occasional missile in the hope of disturbing the French engineers. Night was when the batteries were dug, trenches extended, but the time was not yet right for the Portuguese troops to sally out of the defences and raid the French works in the nighttime assault of bayonets in enemy trenches. The French were not close enough yet. A siege worked to a timetable, understood by both sides, and this was just the beginning, when the besiegers' ring was not yet complete, and the fortress town was at the height of its strength and pride. He led the way on the rampart's top to the north gate, and Harper watched his captain stare moodily down at the sentries, the vast gate, the companies of infantry who lived between the granite traps to guard the entrance of the town. Harper guessed what was in Sharp's mind. "No way out, sir." No. The last small chance gone. "No. Back to the house." They went down steps and found a street that went towards the lower town, and Sharp stayed away from the dark houses with their blind windows and shut-up doors. Their boots rang cold on the cobbles as they peered into alleyways, up the cross streets, and once or twice Harper thought he saw a shadow that was too irregular to be part of a building, but he couldn't be sure. Almeida was quiet, eerie. Sharp drew his sword.
"Sir?"
Harper's voice was worried.
"You wouldn't be planning, would you, to—"
They had forgotten the rooftops. But Helmut, alerted by a sound, had turned, looked up, and the man who dropped on him screamed terribly as the sabre pierced him. Sharp went right, Harper left, and the street was suddenly full of men with swords, dark clothes, and the dying man's pathetic whimpers. Hagman was using his bayonet, backed against a wall, and letting El Católico's men come to him, and Sharp, by the same wall, twisted desperately to one side, as a rapier blade came at him and missed his waist by inches. He parried a second man with the sword, remembered El Católico calling it a butcher's weapon, and, forsaking technique for anger, he hacked with it once and felt the edge hit something, bite, and slide free. He turned back to the first attacker, but Roach was there, massive and ponderous, pounding the life from the man with his rifle butt, and Sharp twisted back, flickered his sword out in a blind lunge and felt it parried, pushed aside. And he leapt back, knowing the attack was coming, tripped on the dead man and fell backwards. The fall saved his life. The 7-barrel gun, held against the far wall, fizzed as the spark lit the pan, and then blasted a channel clear across the street. The sound, magnified by the close walls, rang in Sharp's head, but he saw 3 men staggering, one down, and Roach pulled him to his feet, and he went forward into the confusion of the blast, and chopped down on one man, kicked a second, and suddenly the 4 British were together, across the street, and the Spanish were caught between them and the 3 men of the King's German Legion. The Germans had done well. The sabre was their weapon, and they fought the swordsman with their own skills. Sharp knew he had to learn the art of the sword, but this was no time to try. He hacked forward, his left arm hurting, but the right chopping diagonally down, left and right, pushing opponents to either side, where Roach and Hagman bayoneted them. And the partisans, their surprise gone, began to run, to slip past the Germans and escape into the night. Helmut growled. With these odds there was no point in trying to kill, and he had small chance of beating the long rapiers with their delicate finesse. He used his curved sabre in short economic strokes, going for the eyes, always the eyes, because a man will run before he loses his sight, and Helmut sent his attackers reeling, one after the other, hands clasped to their faces and blood showing between the fingers. The Spanish had had enough. They ran, but the short sergeant dropped his sabre, grabbed one by the arm, hugged him like a bear, and then, quickly releasing him, swung him against a wall with all his force. It sounded like a sack of turnips falling from the top of a barn onto a stone floor. Harper grinned at him, wiped blood from his sword bayonet. "Very nice, Helmut." There was a shout from down the street. The flare of torches, and the 6 men whirled round, weapons raised, but Sharp ordered them to wait. A Portuguese patrol, muskets ready, pounded towards them, and Sharp saw the officer leading with a drawn sword. The officer stopped, suspicion on his face, and then grinned, spread his arms, and laughed. "Richard Sharp! Of all the devils, what are you doing?" Sharp laughed, wiped the blood off his blade, and pushed it into the scabbard. He turned to Harper. "Sergeant, meet Tom Garrard, once a sergeant in the 33rd, now a lieutenant in the Portuguese army." He took Garrard's hand, shook it. "You bastard, how are you?" Garrard beamed at him, turned to Harper. "We were sergeants together. Christ, Dick, it must be bloody years. I remember you blowing the face off that bloody little heathen. Oh, it's good to see you. A bloody captain. What's the world coming to?" He gave Sharp a salute and laughed. "It's years since anyone called me Dick. You well?" "Chipper! Couldn't be better." He jerked a thumb at his men. "Good lads, these. Fight like us. Well, well, well. You remember that girl in Syring, Nancy?" Sharp's men looked at Garrard curiously. It was a year since the Portuguese government had asked the British to reorganize their army, and one of the changes, started by the Englishman, Marshal Beresford, who now commanded the Portuguese troops, was to offer commissions to experienced British sergeants so that the raw, untrained Portuguese troops were given officers who knew how to fight. It was good, Garrard said, and working well. And he looked at Harper. "You should join up, Sergeant." Harper grinned, shook his head. "I'll stay with him." "Well, you could do worse." Garrard looked at Sharp. Trouble? It's over. Garrard sheathed his sword. Anything I can do? Open a gate for us. Tonight. Garrard looked at him shrewdly. How many of you? 250. Cavalry and us. Christ, mate, that's impossible. I thought you meant just you 7 only. He stopped, grinned. You, with this gold? That's us. You know about it? God almighty. Bloody orders from everyone to stop the gold leaving. We didn't even know there was any gold here. He shook his head. I'm sorry, Dick. Can't help. Sharp grinned. Doesn't matter. We'll manage. You will. He grinned again. I heard about Talavera. That was bloody well done. It really was. Sharp pointed at Harper. He was with me. Garrard nodded to the Irishman. Proud of you. He looked at his men. We'll do it next time, won't we, lads? The Portuguese smiled back, nodded shyly to Sharp. Oh, we must go, Tom. Work to do. The farewells were said, promises to look each other up that might or might not ever be kept, and Sharp accepted Garrard's offer for the Portuguese soldiers to clear the bodies off the street. Go easy, Dick. And you. Sharp looked at Harper. Did you see El Católico? The sergeant shook his head. There were enough of him, sir, but not him. Perhaps he doesn't do his own dirty work. Then where? Sharp looked up at the roofs, the rooftops. He turned to the sergeant. Do we have sentries on the roof? The roof? Alarm showed on the big face. Sweet Jesus! Come on! They began running. Not again, thought Sharp. Please God, not again. He remembered Josephina lying in the blood-stained sheets. He ran faster, the sword in his hand. Open up! The sentries turned, startled, and pushed open the courtyard gate. There was a smell of horses, torchlight, and he leapt up the steps, banged open the kitchen door, and there was the company eating, the firelight, candles, and Teresa, unharmed at the end of the table. He breathed a sigh of relief, shook his head, and Lossow came over the floor. Welcome back. What is it? Sharp pointed to the ceiling. Upstairs. He was trying to catch his breath. Upstairs. The bastard's waiting upstairs. Chapter 22. Lossow shook his head. He's not here. He's close. The German shrugged. We've searched. They had looked in every room, every cupboard, even up chimneys and on the thick tiled roof, but there was no sign of El Católico or his men. Sharp was not satisfied. The other houses? Yes, my friend. Lossow was patient. The Germans had opened up houses either side, to sleep in glorious space and comfort, and all had been searched. The cavalryman took Sharp's elbow. Come and eat. The company, those not on guard, were in the kitchen, where a pot bubbled on the flames. Parry Jenkins lifted it clear with a pot-hook. Real stew, sir. The goal was locked in a storeroom with a barrel of wine. Sergeant McGovern in grim charge, and Sharp glanced at the door as he spooned down the meat and vegetables. Behind the padlock and bolts was the dragon's hoard, and Sharp remembered the stories well. If a man stole buried gold, the dragon would take its vengeance, and there would be only one way to avoid that revenge, by killing the dragon. The attack in the street, only half pressed home, was not the end of the matter. Sharp guessed that El Católico had parties throughout the small town looking for the rifleman, but the dragon would want to be there at the death, to see the agony. Lossow watched Sharp eat. You think he'll come tonight? Sharp nodded. He's offered to stay on tomorrow to help the defence, but that's just insurance. He wants it over with. He wants to get out before the French seal this place tight. Then he wants to leave tomorrow. Knowles shrugged. Perhaps he won't come, sir. He's getting the gold, isn't he? Sharp grinned. He thinks so. He glanced at Teresa. No, he'll come. He grinned at the girl. Major Kearsey thinks you should go back. She raised her eyebrows, said nothing. Before Sharp had left Cox's headquarters, Kearsey had taken him aside, pleaded that Teresa should be returned to her father. Sharp had nodded. Send her father at 10 o'clock tomorrow, sir. Now he watched her. What do you want to do? She looked at him almost with a challenge.
"What will you do?"
Sharp's men and some of the Germans were listening to the conversation. Sharp jerked his head at the door.
"Come into the small room, we'll talk."
Harper took a jug of wine, Losov and Knowles their curiosity. The girl followed them. She paused outside the small sitting-room door and put cool fingers on his hand.
"Are you going to win, Richard?"
He smiled. Yes. If he did not, then she was dead. El Católico would want revenge on her. Inside the small room they pulled off dust covers and sat in comfortable chairs. Sharp was tired, bone-tired, and his shoulder was aching with a deep throbbing pain. He trimmed a candle wick, waited for the flame to grow, and talked softly. "You all know what's happening. We're ordered to surrender the gold tomorrow. Captain Losov is ordered to leave, and we are ordered to stay." He had already told them as they searched the houses, but he wanted to go over it, to look for the flaws, because he still hoped that the decision would prove unnecessary. Losov stirred in his chair. "So, it's all over?" He frowned, not believing his own question. "No. Whether Cox likes it or not, we go." "And the gold?" Teresa's voice was steady. "Goes with us." By some strange instinct, they all relaxed, as if the statement were enough. "The question is," Sharp went on, "how?" There was silence in the room. Harper looked asleep, his eyes closed, but Sharp guessed that the Irishman was way ahead of the others. Knowles pummeled his chair arm in frustration. "If only we could get a message to the General! We're too late, time's run out." Sharp did not expect them to provide an answer, but he wanted them to think through the steps, to know the argument, so that when he provided the solution, they would agree. Losov leant forward into the candlelight. "Cox won't let you go. He thinks we're stealing the gold." "He's right." Teresa shrugged. Knowles was frowning. "Do we break out, sir? Make a room for it?" Sharp thought of the granite-faced ditches, the rows of cannon, the bent tunnels and the gateways with their portcullises and grim-faced sentries. "No, Robert." Losov grinned. "I know! Murder Brigadier Cox!" Sharp did not smile. His second-in-command would back up his orders. "Good God, I was joking!" Losov stared at Sharp, suddenly convinced of the rifleman's seriousness. Somewhere a dog barked, perhaps in the French camp, and Sharp knew that if the British survived this campaign, if he did his duty this night, then it would all have to be done again. Portugal reconquered, the border fortresses retaken, the French beaten not just from Spain, but from all Europe. Losov must have mistaken his expression for despair. The German spoke softly. "Have you thought of abandoning the gold?" No. It was not true. He took a deep breath. "I can't tell you why. I don't know how, but the difference between victory and failure depends on that gold. We have to take it out." He nodded at Teresa. "She's right. We are stealing the gold, on Wellington's instructions, and that's why there are no explicit orders. The Spanish—" He shrugged apologetically at the girl. "God knows they're difficult allies. Think how much worse if they had written proof of this." He leant back. "I can only tell you what I was told. The gold is more important than men, horses, regiments, or guns. If we lose it, the war is over. We'll all go home, or more likely end up as French prisoners." "And if you do take it?" Teresa was shivering. "Then the British will stay in Portugal." He shrugged. "I can't explain that, but it's true. And if we stay in Portugal, then next year we'll be back in Spain. The gold will go with us." Knowles snapped his fingers. "Kill El Católico!" Sharp nodded. "Oh, we'll probably have to, but Cox's orders are still for the gold to go to the Spanish. So—" Knowles was about to ask how. He shrugged instead. Teresa stood up. "Is your coat upstairs?" Sharp nodded. "Cold?" She still had only the thin white dress. He stood up as well, thinking of his fear of El Católico. "I'll come with you." Harper and Losov stood, but Sharp waved them down. "We'll be all right, a minute, no more. Think about it, gentlemen." He led the way up the stairs, peering into the darkness, and Teresa put her hand out to him. "You think he's here?" "I know he is." It seemed ridiculous. The house had been searched and researched, sentries put on balconies and roof. Yet all Sharp's instincts said that El Católico would come for his revenge this night. Revenge, the Spanish said, was a dish best eaten cold. But for El Católico, it was a dish that should be taken quickly, before Sharp was locked up in the siege. And Sharp had no doubt that El Católico wanted revenge, not for the gold, but for the insult to his manhood. And the rifleman drew his sword as they went into the candle-lit room with its canopied bed and wide cupboards. Teresa found Sharp's coat, put it round her shoulders. "See? It's safe." "Go downstairs. Tell them I'll be 2 minutes." She raised her eyebrows at him, looked puzzled, but he pushed her through the door and watched as she went back to the small room. Sharp could feel the hairs rise on his neck, the prickling of the blood beneath his skin, the old signs that the enemy was near. And he sat on the bed and pulled off his heavy boots so he could move silently. He wanted El Católico to be near, to get this thing over, so that he could concentrate on what must be done tomorrow. He thought of the Spaniard's flickering rapier, the careless skill, but it must be faced, be beaten, or else in the morning he would be constantly looking behind him, worrying about the girl. And he padded across the boards and blew out the candles. The sword was monstrously heavy. A butcher's blade, the Spaniard had called it. He opened the curtains and stood on the balcony. On the next balcony a sentry stirred. Above him, between the pitches of the roof, he could hear the mutterings of 2 Germans. It had to be this night. El Católico would not let the insult go, would not want to be immured in Almeida as the French sapped their way forward. But how? Nothing stirred in the street. The houses and church across the road were dark and shuttered. Only the glow of the French campfires lit the southern sky beyond the walls, where he was supposed to stand guard tomorrow. The tower of the church was silhouetted by the red glow, its 2 heavily counterweighted bells sheen by the distant fires. And there was no ladder. There had been that morning. He knew. He tried to be sure and remembered opening the curtains, turning away from Teresa's nakedness and seeing the bells with the metal ladder that was leaning against the tower. Then he had turned back, but he was sure the ladder had been there. So why take the ladder? He looked left and right, at the sentries on the balconies. Of course! Knowles, with his sense of decency, had placed no sentry on this balcony, on every balcony in the street except this one, so that no member of the company should be forced to listen to the unmarried exploits of Captain Sharp. And El Católico was no fool. It was 100 to 1 that the unguarded balcony would be the one to assault, and the ladder would reach from the church roof with its convenient platform across the street. And while muskets from the church took care of the sentries, El Católico and his best men would be across the iron rungs, through the curtains, and revenge was sweet. He paused there, thinking it was fantastic, but why not? At the dead of night, 3 or 4 in the morning, when the sentries were struggling to stay awake, and anyway, there was only one way to find out. He swung his leg over the balcony, hushed the sentry at the next balustrade, and dropped into the street.
End of Disc 7. Disc 8.
The group in the small room would wonder where he was, but it needn't take long. Forewarned was forearmed, and he sneaked silently on his bootless feet into the alley that angled behind the church. He was out of sight of the sentries, close to the church wall, and he held his huge sword in front of him, its blade a dull sheen in the darkness, and listened for any noise. Nothing, except the far-off dog, the sound of the wind. He felt the excitement inside, the imminence of danger, but still there was no sound, no movement, and he peered up at the church roof's edge, innocent in the moonlight. There was a small door in the wall, barred and locked, and beside it the masonry was rough and crudely repaired. It occurred to him that maybe his idea was too fantastic, that all El Católico had to do was pour musket fire from the church roof into the unguarded room, that the ladder had merely been taken to help the partisans climb up from the alley. But he knew he wouldn't be satisfied until he had seen over the roof's edge. So he stuck the huge sword behind his back, jammed it into his belt with the handle over his shoulder, and reached up with his right hand for a grip on the masonry blocks. He moved infinitely slowly, climbing as silently as a lizard, feeling with his toes for each foothold, and reaching up with his hands for the convenient gaps between the stones. His left shoulder hurt, made him wince with pain, but he moved up because he could see the top, and it was not far, and he couldn't rest until this private business was done. Harper would be annoyed at not being invited, but this was Sharp's business. Teresa was his woman, and he knew as he inched upwards that he would miss her terribly. The handholds ran out as he neared the top. A cornice went round the roof, a foot deep and smooth-faced, and he couldn't reach the top. He needed one more handhold, and he saw it, off to his left, where a metal stanchion jutted diagonally downwards to support a lamp holder over the doorway. He reached for it, found the rusting metal, tugged, and it held. He transferred his weight, brought up his right foot, could feel the burden of his body transferred to his piercing left shoulder, and then the stanchion moved. It was a tiny movement, a grating of metal on stone, but it threw him off balance. His left arm saved him, and it was as if someone had plunged a flesh hook into his armpit, was gouging and twisting, and he sobbed with agony as fresh blood sprang from the opened wound and soaked his chest. He clenched eyes and teeth, gasped with the pain, and, throwing caution aside, threw up his right arm, found the very top of the cornice, and slowly, with exquisite relief, took the weight from his left arm. He froze, waiting for a blow on his exposed right hand, but nothing moved. Perhaps the roof was deserted. He pushed with his right foot, pulled upwards with his hand, and slowly, inch by inch, his eyes went past the stonework, and there, suddenly, was the sky. And he was forced to use his left arm, over the top, endured the pain while his right found a secure purchase, and he could heave himself onto the flat top of the cornice and see what he had feared to see, an empty roof. Except that one thing was wrong. There was a smell of tobacco, where there should have been none. He took his sword from its place behind his back and crouched just within the cornice, his left arm next to the deeply curved tiles that rose above him, blocking his view of the house where Harper and Lossow would now be looking for him. Behind him, the roof was deserted, deeply shadowed in the moonlight, but in front he could see the bell tower, the ladder lying at its foot, and the flat space that held the trapdoor. He could see only part of the space, a small part, and he could smell tobacco smoke, and it was not from his sentries. The wind was from the south, and he felt a fierce confirmation of his suspicions as he crept forward, each step showing more of the flat roof that was tucked into a corner of the church's cross-like roof shape. It was empty, mocking him, white stonework in the moonlight, and the ladder had presumably been put there for some repairs and later taken down, though who would repair anything just before the French began their bombardment was a mystery. He padded into the space, a large square area, and still was hidden from the house by the loom of the transept roof. And now he could hear voices across the street calling him. He could hear Harper, alarmed, and Lossow shouting at sentries, and he was about to call back when he heard the creak, and jumped to one side. The trapdoor opened, an inch or two at first, sending out a plume of cigar smoke. Then it was pushed back until held by a chain, and a man appeared, dark-cloaked, who climbed onto the roof and did not see Sharp in the shadow by the tower, because he didn't expect to see anything. The man, heavily moustached, crossed to the transept roof, then past it till he could see the street, then softly called back in Spanish. The partisan must have heard the commotion, Sharp thought, and sent a sentry to look. The man puffed on his cigar, listened to the shouts, and crouched to stub it out. No one else had appeared. The church interior was in darkness. Sharp hardly breathed as he pushed himself close to the stonework. An urgent whisper came from the ladder beneath the trapdoor. The man with the cigar nodded. "Si, si." He sounded weary, yawned, and came back to the ladder. At first he was not sure what he saw, just a shadow, and he peered at the shape. The shape moved, turned into a man with a sword, and the tired sentry jumped back, opened his mouth, but Sharp was ramming the blade forward, aiming at the throat, and he missed. It grated on a rib, slid, and then went home. But the man had shouted, and there were feet on the ladder. The damn sword was stuck. Sharp let the blade go down with its victim, put his foot on the man's chest, turned, and felt the suction give way and the blade free itself. There was a second man half out of the trapdoor, a pistol in his hand, and Sharp ducked, threw the sword out as the gun exploded and the ball hammered into the roof tiles. Sharp shouted an inarticulate challenge, flailed the blade down on the man, and heard him fall from the ladder. He grabbed the trapdoor, was about to shut it. "No!" The voice was from below. The church suddenly lit up. "Wait!" It was El Cattolico's voice, deep and silken. "Who is that?" "Sharp." He was standing behind the trapdoor, invisible from below, unassailable. El Cattolico chuckled. "May I come up?" "Why?" "You can't come down. There are too many of us, so I have to come up. Will you let me up?" There were shouts across the street. "Captain! Captain!" He ignored them. "Just you?" "Just me." The voice was amused, tolerant. Sharp heard the footsteps on the ladder, saw the light coming, and then a hand put an unmasked lantern on the roof, and there was El Cattolico's dark head, turning, smiling, and the other hand brought up his rapier, which he tossed ringing onto the far side of the roof. "There! Now you can kill me. You won't, though, because you are a man of honor." "Am I?" El Cattolico smiled again, still halfway through the trapdoor. "Kirsi doesn't think so, but Kirsi equates honor with God. You don't. May I come up? I'm alone." Sharp nodded. He waited till the tall Spaniard was on the roof, and then kicked the trapdoor shut. It was heavy, thick enough to stop a bullet, but for added safety Sharp pulled the iron ladder on top. El Cattolico watched. "You are nervous. They won't come up." He cocked a friendly eye at Sharp. "Why are you here?" The ladder was missing. The tall Spaniard looked puzzled. The hands spread apart in an uncertain gesture. "Missing?" Sharp kicked it. "It was up the tower this morning. This evening it was gone." "Ah!" he laughed. "We used it to climb the church wall." He looked at Sharp's dishevelled uniform. "I see you had other methods." In one of his graceful gestures he opened his cloak. "You see? No pistol. I have only the sword." He made no attempt to pick it up. Above the church roof Sharp could see the sudden flare of torches. Search parties were starting out. There was sweat on the palm of his sword hand, but he wouldn't give the Spaniard the satisfaction of seeing him wipe it off. "Why are you here?" "To pray with you." El Cattolico laughed, jerked his head at the street. "They're making so much noise they won't hear us." "No, Captain. I'm here to kill you." Sharp smiled. "Why? You've got the gold." El Cattolico nodded. "I don't trust you, Sharp. As long as you're alive, I don't think the gold will be easy to collect, though Brigadier Cox presents you with a problem." Sharp acknowledged it with a nod, and El Cattolico looked at him shrewdly. "How are you going to solve it?" "The same way that I intend to solve it tomorrow." He wished he were as confident as he sounded. He had seen El Cattolico in action, measured swords with him, and he was thinking desperately how he could win the fight that must start soon. The tall Spaniard smiled, gestured at his rapier. "Do you mind? You can't kill me, of course, before I reach it, but I don't think you will." He had talked as he moved, and then he stopped, picked it up and turned round. "I was right, you see. You are a man of honor." Sharp could feel the new blood wet on his chest, and he rested his sword as the Spaniard with a studied ease dropped his cloak and flexed the blade. El Cattolico took the tip of the rapier in his left hand and bent it almost double. "A fine blade, Captain. From Toledo. But then I forgot we have already tried each other." He moved into the swordsman's crouch, right leg bent, left leg extended behind. "On guard!" The rapier flickered towards Sharp, but the rifleman did not move. El Cattolico straightened. "Captain, do you not want to fight?
I assure you it's a better death than the one I had planned. What was that? Sharp thought of the ladder, the sudden rush in the dark. The Spaniard smiled. A distraction down the street, a fire, lots of shouts, and you would have come to your balcony, the ever-ready captain, prepared for battle, and then a volley of shots would have stopped you forever. Sharp smiled. It was far simpler than his extraordinary imaginings, and it would have worked. And the girl? Teresa? El Católico's pose slipped a little. He shrugged. What could she have done with you dead? She would have been forced back. You would have enjoyed that. The Spaniard shrugged. En garde, Captain. Sharp had so little time. He had to unsettle the Spaniard's elegant posture. El Católico knew he would win, could afford to be magnanimous, was anticipating the inevitable display of his superior swordsmanship. Sharp still kept his blade low, and the rapier went down. Captain, are you frightened? El Católico smiled gently. You're afraid I'm the better man? Teresa says not. It was not much, but enough. Sharp saw the fury in El Católico's face, the sudden loss of control, and he brought up the huge blade, rammed it forward, and knew that El Católico would not parry but simply kill him for the insult. The rapier flickered, lightning fast. But Sharp turned his body, saw the blade go past, and brought his elbow hard into El Católico's ribs, turned back and hammered down with the brass-guarded hilt of the sword onto the Spaniard's head. El Católico was fast. He twisted away, the blow glanced off his skull, but Sharp heard the grunt, and he followed it with a sweeping pillar of a blow. A stroke that would have disemboweled an ox, and the Spaniard leapt backwards, and again, and Sharp had failed. And he knew with a fighter's instinct that El Católico had recovered, survived the devastating attack, and would now fall back on his skill. There was a hammering from downstairs, the blast of a musket, and El Católico smiled. Time to die, Sharp. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine. He came forward like quicksilver, past Sharp's clumsy parry, and the blade drew blood at Sharp's waist. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. The voice was like silk, beautiful and hypnotic, and the blade went to the other side of Sharp's waist, razored his skin, and was gone. Sharp knew he was being toyed with, a plaything, while the prayer lasted, and he could do nothing. He remembered Helmut's techniques and went for El Católico's eyes, stabbing the empty air, and the Spaniard laughed. Go slow, Sharp. Te decet hymnos Deus in Sion. Sharp lunged desperately for the eyes. Helmut had made it look easy, but El Católico just swayed to one side and the rapier came low at the rifleman, aiming at the thigh for another flesh wound, and Sharp had only one desperate, insane idea left. He let the rapier come, kicked his right thigh forward and pushed the blade painfully into his flesh so that El Católico could not use it. The Spaniard tried to drag it free. Sharp felt the tearing in his leg. But he had the initiative, was still driving forward, and he hit the Spaniard with the heavy guard of the sword, scraping it up the face, and El Católico abandoned the rapier and went backwards. Sharp followed, the rapier stuck clean through his thigh, and El Católico grabbed at it, missed, and Sharp swept his blade down, caught El Católico's forearm. The Spaniard cried out, and Sharp back-swung him with the flat of his blade, a scything crack across the skull, and the partisan fell. Sharp stopped. There were shouts below. "Captain! Up here! On the church roof!" He could hear footsteps below, pounding in the alleyway, and he suspected the partisans were abandoning the unequal conflict. He stopped, and took hold of El Católico's rapier. The wound hurt, but Sharp knew he'd been lucky. The blade had gone through the outer muscles, and the blood and pain were worse than the damage. He pulled at the sword, clenching his teeth, and it slid free. He held the rapier in his hands, felt its fine balance, and knew he could never have defeated it, except for the madness of driving his body onto the inlaid blade and denying El Católico his skill. The Spaniard moaned, still unconscious, and Sharp crossed to him, bleeding and limping, and looked down at his enemy. His eyes were closed, the lids flickering slightly, and Sharp took his own sword, put it at El Católico's throat. "A butcher's blade, eh?"
He stabbed down till the point hit the roof, twisted it, then kicked the neck free of the blade. That was for Claude Hardy. There would be no fiefdom in the mountains, no private kingdom for El Cattolico. There was a thumping on the trapdoor. "Who's that?" "Sergeant Harper." "Wait!" He pushed the ladder to one side, and the trapdoor was pushed up, and Harper appeared, a smoking torch in one hand. The Irishman looked first at Sharp, then at the body.
"God save Ireland! What were you doing, sir? A competition to see who could bleed the most."
"He wanted to kill me." The eyebrows went up.
"Really?"
Harper looked at the dead man.
"He was a fine swordsman, sir. How did you do it?"
Sharp told him. How he'd gone for the eyes, failed, so had impaled himself on the sword. Harper listened, shook his head.
"You're a bloody fool, sir. Well, let's see the leg."
Teresa came up, followed by Lossow and Knowles, and the story had to be told again, and Sharp felt the tension flow out of him. He watched Teresa kneel by the body. "Does it upset you?" She shook her head, busy at something, and Sharp watched as she searched beneath the blood-stained clothes and found, round the dead man's waist, a money belt thick with coins. She opened one of the pockets. "Gold." "Keep it." Sharp was feeling his leg, tracing the wound, and he knew he'd been lucky, and that the blade had torn a smaller wound than his stupidity deserved. He looked up at Harper. "I'll need the maggots." Harper grinned. In a tin box he kept fat white maggots that lived only on dead flesh, spurning healthy tissue, and nothing cleaned a simple wound better than a handful dropped into the cut and bound in with a bandage. The Irishman took Sharp's sash as a temporary dressing, bound it tight.
"It'll mend, sir."
Lossow looked at the body. "What now?" "Now?" Sharp wanted a glass of wine, another plate of that stew. "Nothing. They have another leader. We still have to hand the gold over." Teresa spoke in Spanish, angry and vehement, and Sharp smiled. What was that, sir?" Knowles was stunned by the blood on the roof. "I don't think she likes the new leaders." Sharp flexed his left arm. "If El Cattolico's lieutenants don't produce the gold, then they may not be leaders much longer. Is that right?" She nodded. "Then who will be?" Knowles sat down on the parapet. "La aguja." Sharp had trouble pronouncing the Spanish J. Teresa laughed, pleased, and Harper looked up from his own excursion into El Cattolico's pockets.
"La what?"
"La aguja, the needle. Teresa." "We have a bargain." Knowles looked astonished. "Teresa? Miss Moreno? Why not? She fights better than most of them." He had made up the name, saw that it pleased her. "But to make that happen, we must keep the gold from the Spanish, get it out of the city, and finish this job." Lossow sighed, scraped his unused sabre back into its curved scabbard. "Which brings us back to the old question, my friend. How?" Sharp had dreaded this moment, wanted to lead them gently towards it, but it had come. "Who's stopping us?" Lossow shrugged. "Cox." Sharp nodded. He spoke patiently. "And Cox has his authority as commander of the garrison. If there were no garrison, there would be no authority, no way to stop us." "So?" Knowles was frowning. "So, at dawn tomorrow we destroy the garrison." There was a moment's utter silence, broken by Knowles. "We can't!" Teresa laughed at the sheer joy of it. "We can! God in his heaven!" Lossow's face was appalled, fascinated. Harper didn't seem surprised. "How?" So Sharp told them. Chapter 23. Almeida stirred early that Monday morning. It was well before first light as men stamped their boots on cobbled streets and made the small talk that is the talisman against great events. The war, after all, had come to the border town, and between the defenders' outer glasses and the masked guns of the French, the hopes and fears of Europe were concentrated. In far-off cities men looked at maps. If Almeida could hold, then perhaps Portugal could be saved, but they knew better. 8 weeks at the most, they said, and probably just 6. And then Massena's troops would have Lisbon at their mercy. The British had had their run, and now it was over, the last hurdles to be cleared. But in St. Petersburg and Vienna, Stockholm and Berlin, they let the maps curl up and wondered where the victorious blue-jacketed troops would be next sent. A pity about the British, but what did anyone expect? Cox was on the southern ramparts, standing by a brazier, waiting for the first light to show him the new French batteries. Yesterday the French had fired a few shots, destroying the telegraph, but today Cox knew things would begin in earnest. He hoped for a great defence, a struggle that would make the history books, that would block the French till the rains of late autumn could save Portugal. But he also imagined the siege guns, the paths blasted through the great walls, and then the screaming, steel-tipped battalions that would come forward in the night to drown his hopes in chaos and defeat. Cox and the French both knew the town was the last obstacle to French victory, and, hope as Cox did, in his heart he didn't believe that the town could hold out till the roads were swamped and the rivers made impassable by rain. High above Cox, by the castle and cathedral that topped Almeida's hill, Sharp pushed open the bakery door. The ovens were curved shapes in the blackness, cold to the touch, and Teresa shivered beside him despite being swathed in the rifleman's long green greatcoat. He ached. His leg, shoulder, the sliced cuts either side of his waist, and a head that throbbed after talking too deep into the early morning. Knowles had pleaded, "There must be another way. Tell me." Now in the cold silence, Sharp still tried to find another way. To talk to Cox, or Kearsey, but only Sharp knew how desperately Wellington needed the gold. To Cox and Kearsey it was unimaginable that a few thousand gold coins could save Portugal, and Sharp could not tell them how, because he hadn't been told. He damned the secrecy. It would mean death for hundreds, but if the gold didn't get through, it would mean a lost war. Teresa would be gone anyway. In a few hours they would part, he to the army, she back to the hills and her own fight. He held her close, smelling her hair, wanting to be with her. But then they stepped apart as footsteps sounded outside and Patrick Harper pushed open the door and peered into the gloom. "Sir?" "We're here. Did you get it?" "No problem." Harper sounded happy enough. He gestured past Helmut. "1 barrel of powder, sir. Compliments of Tom Garrard." "Did he ask what it was for?" Harper shook his head. "He said if it was for you, sir, it was all right." He helped the German bring the great keg through the door. "Bloody heavy, sir." "Will you need help?" Harper straightened up with a scoffing look. "An officer carrying a barrel, sir? This is the army. No, we got it here. We'll do the rest." "You know what to do?" The question was unnecessary. Sharp looked through the dirty window across the plaza, and in the thin light saw that the cathedral doors were still shut. Perhaps the pile of cartridges had been moved. Had Wellington sent a messenger on a fast horse with orders for Cox on the half chance that Sharp was in Almeida? He forced his mind away from the nagging questions. "Let's get on with it." Helmut borrowed Harper's bayonet and chipped at the centre of the barrel, making a hole, widening it till it was the size of a musket muzzle. He grunted his satisfaction. Harper nodded at Sharp. "We'll be on our way." He sounded casual. Sharp made himself grin. "Go slowly." He wanted to tell the sergeant that he didn't have to do it. It was Sharp's dirty work, but he knew what the Irishman would have said. Instead, he watched as the two men, one tall and the other short, picked up the barrel by its ends, jiggled it until powder was flowing from the hole, and then started an awkward progress out the door and across the plaza. They kept to the gutter, Helmut above it and Harper below, which made the task easier, and Sharp, through the window, watched as the powder trickled into the shadow of the stone trough and went inexorably towards the cathedral. He couldn't believe what he was doing, driven by the general's must, and the questions came back. Could Cox be persuaded? Perhaps even worse, gold had arrived from London, and all this was for nothing. And then, in a heart-stopping moment, the cathedral doors opened and 2 sentries came out, adjusting their shakos. And Sharp knew they must see what was happening. He clenched his fists. and Teresa, beside him at the dirty glass pane, was moving her lips in what seemed to be a silent and inappropriate prayer. "Sharp!" He turned, startled, and saw Losov. "You frighten me. It's a guilty conscience." The German stood in the doorway and nodded down the hill, away from the cathedral. "We have the house open, the cellar door. I'll see you there." Sharp planned to light the fuse and then run back to a house they had chosen, a house with a deep cellar that opened onto the street. Losov did not move. He looked at the two sergeants, still ignored by the sentries. "I don't believe this, my friend. I hope you're right." "So do I," thought Sharp, "so do I." It was madness, pure madness. And he put his arm round the girl and watched as the two sergeants threaded the bollards which kept traffic and market stalls from encroaching on the cathedral's ground. The sentries were watching the two sergeants, seeing nothing unusual in two men carrying a barrel, not even stirring as they put it down on one end, hard by the smaller door. "Gott!" Losov whispered the word, watching with them, as Helmut squatted by the barrel and began to work a strake loose so that the fuse could reach the remaining powder in the keg. Harper strolled the 20 yards to the sentries, chatted with them, and Sharp thought of the men who must die. The sentries would surely see the Germans splintering the wood. But no, they laughed with Harper, and suddenly Helmut was walking back, yawning, and the Irishman waved at the sentries and followed him. Sharp took out the tinderbox, the cigar, and with hands that were shaky he struck flint on steel and blew the charred linen in the box into a flame. He lit the cigar, puffed it, hated the taste until the tip glowed red. Losov watched him. "You're sure?" A shrug. "I'm sure." The two sergeants appeared at the doorway, and Losov spoke in German to Helmut, then turned to Sharp. "Good luck, my friend. We'll see you in a minute." Sharp nodded. The two Germans left, and he drew on the cigar again. He looked at the Irishman in the doorway. "Take Teresa." "No." Harper was stubborn. "I stay with you." "And me." Teresa smiled at him. The girl held his arm as he went into the street. The sky was pearl grey over the cathedral, with a wisp of cloud that would soon turn white. It promised to be a beautiful day. He drew on the cigar again, and through his mind went jumbled images of the men who had built the cathedral, carved the saints that guarded its doors, knelt on its wide flagstones, been married there, seen their children baptized in its granite font, and been carried on their last visit up its pillared chancel. He thought of the dry voice saying, "Must," of the priest whitewashing the rood screen, of the battalion with its wives and children, the bodies in the cellar. And he leant down and touched the cigar tip to the powder, and it sparked and fizzed, the flame beginning its journey. The first French shell, fired from an ugly little howitzer in a deep pit, burst on the plaza, and flames shot through the smoke as the casing burst into unnumbered fragments that needled outwards. Before Sharp could move, before the first explosion had ceased, the second howitzer's shell landed, bounced, rolled to the powder trail just yards from the cathedral, hit a bollard, and the sentries dived for shelter as it flamed crashingly apart, and Sharp knew that there was no time to reach the cellar. He plucked at Teresa and Harper. "The ovens!" They ran, through the door and over the counter, and he picked up the girl and thrust her head first into the great brick cave of the bread oven. Harper was clambering into the second, and Sharp waited till Teresa was at the back, and then he heard an explosion. It was small enough, scarcely audible over the crash of French shells and the distant sound of the Portuguese battery's reply, and he knew as he climbed in behind the girl that the barrel had exploded, and he wondered if the cathedral door had held the blast, or if the cartridges had been moved. And then there was a second explosion, louder and more ominous, and Teresa gripped his thigh where it was wounded, and the second explosion seemed to go on like a muffled volley from a battle in deep fog, and he knew that the cartridges, down in their stacks behind the door, were setting each other off in an unstoppable chain of explosions. He wondered, crouched fetus-like in the oven, what was happening in the cathedral. He saw in his mind's eye the lurid flames, gouting shafts of light. And then there was a bigger explosion, and he knew that the chain had reached the powder stacked to the top of the steps. And it was all done now. Nothing could prevent it. The guards in the cathedral were dead. The great Rood was looking down on its last seconds. The eternal presence would soon be swatted out. Another French shell exploded, the fragments clashing on the bakery walls, and it was drowned by a seething roar, growing and terrifying. And in the first crypt, crate by crate, cartridge by cartridge, the ammunition of Almeida was exploding. The stabbing flames were reaching the weakened curtain. The men in the deep crypt would be on their knees, or in panic, the powder for the great guns all around them. He had thought that the sound could only grow till it was the last sound on earth, but it seemed to die into silence that was merely the crackling of flames. And Sharp, knowing it was foolish, uncurled his head and looked through the gap between the oven and its iron door, and he could not believe that the leather curtain had held. And then the hill moved. The sound came not through the air but through the ground itself, like the groaning of rock, and the whole cathedral turned to dust, smoke, and flames that were the colour of blood that scorched through the utter blackness. The French gunners, pausing with shells in their hands, jumped to the top of their pits and looked past the low grey ramparts and crossed themselves. The centre of the town had gone, turned into one giant flame that rolled up and became a boiling cloud of darkness. Men could see things in the flame, great stones, timbers carried upwards as if they were feathers. And then the shock hit the gunners like a giant, hot wind that came with the sound. It was like all the thunder of all the world poured into one town for one moment, for one glimpse of the world's end. The cathedral disappeared, turned into flame, and the castle was scythed clean from the ground, the stones tumbling like toy things. Houses were scarred into flaming shards. The blast took the north of the town, unroofed half the southern slope, and the bakery collapsed onto the ovens. And Sharp, deafened and gasping, choked on the thick dust and heated air. And the girl gripped him, prayed for her soul, and the blast went past like the breath of the apocalypse. On the ramparts the Portuguese died as the wind plucked them outwards. The great defences nearest the cathedral were smashed down, and debris filled the ditches so that a huge flat robe was hammered into the heart of the fortress, and still the powder caught. New boilings of flame and smoke writhed into the horror over Almeida, shudder after shudder. A convulsive spasm of the hilltop, and the monstrous explosions died, leaving only fire and darkness, the stench of hell, a silence where men were deafened by destruction. A French gunner, old in his trade, who had once taught a young Corsican lieutenant how to lay a gun, spat on his hand and touched it to the hot muzzle of the barrel that had fired the last shot. The French were silent, unbelieving, and in the killing ground before them, stones, tiles, and burnt flesh dropped like the devil's rain. 25 miles away, in Celorico, they heard the sound, and the general put down his fork and went to the window and knew, with terrible certainty, what it was. There was no gold. And now the fortress that could have bought him 6 weeks of failing hope had gone. The smoke came later, a huge grey curtain that smeared the eastern sky, turned morning sunlight into dusk, and edged the border hills with crimson like a harbinger of the armies that would follow the cloud to the sea. Almeida had been destroyed. Chapter 24. Kierzy was dead, killed in an instant as he said his prayers on the town rampart, and 500 other men snatched into eternity by the flame. But Sharp didn't know that yet. He knew he was dying, of suffocation and heat, and he braced his back against the smooth, curved interior of the massive oven and pushed with his legs at a charred length of timber that blocked the door. It collapsed, and he pushed himself out into a nightmare, and turned to pull Teresa clear. She spoke to him, but he could hear nothing, and he shook his head and went to the other opening and pushed away some rubble as Harper crawled out, his face ashen. The ovens had saved their lives. They were built like small fortresses, with walls more than 3 feet thick and a curved roof that had sent the blast harmlessly overhead. Nothing else remained. The cathedral was a flaming pit, the castle gone, the houses so much dust and fire. And down the street Sharp had to look 100 yards before he saw a house that had survived the blast, and it was ablaze, the flames licking at the rooms which had been opened to the world, and the heat was grey around them as he took Teresa's arm. A man staggered into the road, naked and bleeding, shouting for help, but they ignored him, ran to the cellar door that was covered with fallen stone, and dragged it clear. There was a thumping beneath and shouts, and Harper, still dazed, pulled back the stones, and the cellar flap was forced open, and Losov and Helmut came out. They spoke to Sharp, who could not hear, and ran towards their own house at the bottom of the hill, away from the horror, through the Portuguese soldiers who stared open-mouthed at the inferno that had once been a cathedral. Sharp dropped in the kitchen, found a bottle of the German's beer, and knocked the top off, put it to his lips, and let the cool liquid flow into his stomach. He hit his ears, shook his head, and his men stared at him. He shook his head again, willing the sound to come back, and felt tears in his eyes. Damn it! The decision had been made, and he put his head back and stared at the ceiling and thought of the general and of the blazing pit, and he hated himself. "You had no choice, sir." Knowles was speaking to him. The voice sounded far away, but he could hear. He shook his head. "There's always a choice. But the war, sir, you said it had to be won." Then celebrated tomorrow, Sharp thought, or the next day, but dear God, I did not know. And he remembered the flung bodies, stripped of all dignity, wiped out in an instant, draped like streaked fungus on the hot rubble. "I know." He turned on his men. "Well, what are you staring at? Get ready to move." He hated Wellington, too, because he knew why the general had picked him, because he wanted a man too proud to fail, and he knew he'd do it for the general again. Ruthlessness was good in a soldier, in a general, or a captain, and men admired it, but that was no reason to think that the ruthless man did not feel the bloody pain as well. Sharp stood up, looked at Losov. "We'd better find Cox." The town was stunned, bereft of sound except for the crackling of flames and the coughing of vomit as men found comrades' charred and shrunken bodies. The smell of roast flesh hung in the air like the stench of the burning bodies after Talavera, but that, Sharp remembered, had been a mistake, an accident of wind and flame, while this chaos, this glimpse of damnation, had been caused by a powder keg that Sharp had caused to be pierced and trailed to the cathedral's door. The bodies were naked, the uniforms seared off by the blast, and they seemed to have shrunk into small black mockeries of human beings. A dead battalion, Sharp thought, killed for the gold, and he wondered if Wellington himself would have put the cigar onto the powder. And then he thrust the thought away as Losov led the way up a sloping rampart to where Cox surveyed the damage. It was all over. Anyone could see that. The town indefensible. But Cox still hoped. He had been weeping at the death and destruction, the sway that had gone through his town and his hopes. How? There were answers offered by the staff officers with Cox, good answers, and they told the brigadier of the French shells that had landed just before the explosion. The officers looked over the wall at the massing crowd of Frenchmen who had come to stare at the giant breach in the town's defences, and at the pall of smoke, as men might watch a once proud king on his deathbed. "A shell," one of the officers told Cox. "It must have set off the small ammunition." "Oh, God!" Cox was close to tears. "We should have had a magazine." Cox tried to stiffen his will to go on fighting, but they all knew it was done. There was no ammunition left, nothing to fight with, and the French would understand. There would be no unpleasantness. The surrender would be discussed in a civilized way, and Cox tried to stave it off, tried to find hope in the smoke-filled air, but finally agreed. "Tomorrow, gentlemen, tomorrow, we fly the flag one more night." He pushed his way through the group and saw Sharp and Losov waiting. "Sharp, Losov! Thank God you're alive! So many gone!" "Yes, sir." Cox was biting back tears. "So many!" Sharp wondered if Tom Garrard had survived. Cox noticed the blood on the rifleman's uniform. "You're wounded?" "No, sir, I'm all right. Permission to leave, sir?" Cox nodded, an automatic reaction. The gold was forgotten in the horror of the lost war. Sharp plucked Losov's sleeve. "Come on." At the bottom of the ramp, a puzzled look on his face, Cesar Moreno waited for them. He put a hand out to stop Sharp. "Teresa?" Sharp smiled, the first smile since the explosion. "She's safe. We're leaving now." "And Joachim?" "Joachim?" For a second Sharp was not certain whom Therese's father was talking about, and then he remembered the fight on the rooftop. "He is dead." "And this?" Cesar Moreno's hand was still on Sharp's sleeve as he looked round the destruction. "An accident." Moreno looked at him and shrugged. "Half our men are dead." There was nothing Sharp could say. Losov broke in. "The horses?" Moreno looked at him and shrugged. "They were not in the house that collapsed. They are all right." "We'll use them." The German went ahead, and Moreno checked Sharp with a hand. "She'll take over, I suppose." The rifleman nodded. "Probably. She can fight." Moreno gave a rueful smile. "She knows whose side to be on." Sharp looked at the smoke, at the flames on the hilltop, smelt the burning. "Don't we all?" He shook himself free, turned again to the grey-haired man. "I'll be back for her. One day." "I know." The French had left their lines to gape at the smoking ruins at the northern wall. There was nothing to stop the company leaving, and they took the gold and went west, under the smoke, and back to the army. The war was not lost. Epilogue. "What happened, Richard?" "Nothing, sir." Hogan moved his horse forward to a patch of succulent grass. "I don't believe you." Sharp stirred in his saddle. He hated riding. "There was a girl." "Is that all?" "All?" "She was special." The breeze from the sea was cool on his face. The water sparkled with a million flashes of light, like a giant army of lance-tips, and beating northwards towards the channel, a frigate laid its grey sails towards the land and left a streak of white in its path. Hogan watched the ship. "Dispatches." "News of victory?" Sharp's tone was ironic. "They won't believe it. It's a phony victory." Hogan stared at the distant horizon, miles out to sea from the hilltop where their horses stood. "Do you see the fleet out there? A convoy going home." Sharp grunted, felt the twinge in his healing shoulder. "More money for the bloody merchants. Why couldn't they have sent it here?" Hogan smiled. "There's never enough, Richard. Never. There'd better be now, after what we did to get it here." "What did you do?" "I told you nothing." He stared a challenge at the gentle Irish major. "We were sent to get it, we got it, and we brought it back." "The General's pleased." Hogan said it in a neutral tone. "He bloody better be pleased, for Christ's sake." "He thought you were lost." Hogan's horse moved again, cropping the grass, and the major took off his cocked hat and fanned his face. "Pity about Almeida." Sharp made a face. "Pity about Almeida." Hogan sighed patiently. "We thought it was done for. We heard the explosion, of course, and there was no gold. Without the gold there was no chance." "There was a little chance." Sharp almost spat the words at him, and Hogan shrugged. "No, not a chance you'd want, Richard." Sharp let his anger sink. He thought of the girl, watched the frigate flap its sails and bend into its next tack. "Which would you rather have had, sir?" His voice was very cold, very far away. "The gold or Almeida?" Hogan pulled his horse's head up. "The gold, Richard. You know that." "You're sure?" Hogan nodded. "Very sure. Thousands might have died without the gold." "But we don't know that." Hogan waved his arm at the landscape. "We do." It was a miracle, perhaps one of the greatest feats of military engineering, and it had taken up the gold. The gold had been needed, desperately needed, or the work would never have been finished, and the 10,000 labourers, some of whom Sharp could see, could have packed up their shovels and picks and simply waited for the French. Sharp watched the giant scrapers, hauled by lines of men and oxen, shaping the hills. "What do you call it?" "The lines of Torres Vedras." 3 lines barred the Lisbon Peninsula. 3 giant fortifications made with the hills themselves, fortifications that dwarfed the granite works at Almeida. The first line, on which they rode, was 26 miles long, stretching from the Atlantic to the Tagus, and there were 2 others behind it. The hills had been steepened, crowned with gun batteries, and the lowland flooded. Behind the hill crests, sunken roads meant that the 25,000 garrison troops could move unseen by the French, and the deep valleys, where they could not be filled, were blocked with thorn trees, thousands of them, so that from the air it must have looked as if a giant's child had shaped the landscape the way a boy played with a few square inches of wet soil by a stream. Sharp stared eastwards at the unending line, and he found it hard to believe. So much work, so many escarpments made by hand, crowned with hundreds of guns encased in stone forts, their embrasures looking to the north, to the plain where Massena would be checked. Hogan rode alongside him. "We can't stop him, Richard, not till he gets here, and here he stays. And we're back there." Sharp pointed towards Lisbon, 30 miles to the south. Hogan nodded. "It's simple. He'll never break the lines, never. They're too strong, and he can't go round. The Navy's there. So here he stops, and the rains start, and in a couple of months he'll be starving, and we come out again to reconquer Portugal." "And on into Spain?" Sharp asked. "On into Spain." Hogan sighed, waved again at the huge scar of the unbelievable fortress. "And we ran out of money. We had to get money." "And you got it." Hogan bowed to him. "Thank you. Tell me about the girl." Sharp told him as they rode towards Lisbon, crossing the second and third lines that would never be used. He remembered the parting after they had left the river fortress, unchallenged, and the light company, clumsily mounted on the Spanish horses, had bounced after Lossov's Germans. One French patrol had come near them, but the Germans had wheeled to meet it, their sabres drawn in one hissing movement, and the French had sheered away. They'd stopped beside the Coa, and Sharp had handed Teresa the 1,000 gold coins he had promised. She had smiled at him. "This will be enough. Enough for our needs. We go on fighting." The wind had brought the stench of burning and death into the hills, and Sharp had looked at her, at the dark, hawk-like beauty. "You can stay with us," she had smiled. "No. But you can come back. One day." He had nodded at the rifle slung on her shoulder. "Give it to Ramon. I promised." She looked surprised. "It's mine!" "No." He had unslung his own rifle, checked the butt plate, that all the cleaning equipment was there, and handed it across with his ammunition pouch. "This is yours, with my love. I'll get another one." She had smiled, shaken her head. "I'm sorry." "So am I." "We'll meet again." "I know." She turned her horse and waved. "Kill all the French!" he shouted. "All there are!" And she was gone, galloping with her father and his men, her men, up to the secret paths that would lead them home, to the war of the knife and ambush. And he missed her. Missed her. He smiled at Hogan. "You heard about Hardy? Sad. He has a brother. Did you know?" "No." Hogan nodded. "A naval lieutenant, Giles Hardy, and just like his brother, mad as a coot." "And Josephina?" Hogan smiled, sniffed his snuff, and Sharp waited for the sneeze. Hogan wiped away the tears. "She's here. Do you want to see her?" "Yes." Hogan laughed. "She's, rather celebrated now." He did not explain. They rode in the lengthening shadows down the paved highway into Lisbon. It was crowded with carts carrying building stone, and with the labourers, who were making one of the great wonders of the military world, a fortress covering 500 square miles that would stop the French in the year of 1810 and would never be used again. Sharp admired Wellington for a clever man, because no one, utterly no one outside Lisbon, seemed to know the lines existed, and the French, their tails up, would come hallooing down the southern road and stop. The South Essex, shorn of its light company, was up north, and soon Sharp knew they must march to join it. One battle more, Hogan had said, with any luck and a fair wind, and then the army would march south to the safety of its lines, and Colonel Lawford had greeted him with open arms and waved a dispatch at Sharp. "Reinforcements, Richard! They're on their way! You can bring them up from Lisbon! Officers, sergeants, 270 men! Good news!" The ships had still not come, beating down from Plymouth on the journey that could take 7 days or 7 weeks, and Sharp was content to wait. He slid with relief off the horse and gave Hogan the reins. "I'll see you tomorrow." The Major nodded, scribbled on a piece of paper. "That's her address." Sharp smiled his thanks, turned, but Hogan called after him. "Richard!" "Sir?" "We needed that gold. Well done." 16,000 coins, 250 stolen by El Catolico, 1,000 to Teresa, 14,000 to the General, and the rest was being spent by the Light Company and the Germans as if money were issued with the rations. Sharp had ordered them to get drunk, to find their women, and if any provost asked where the money came from, they were referred to Sharp, and somehow they didn't want to argue with a tall, scarred rifleman who simply told them it was stolen. There was even money in Sharp's name in London, held by the agents, Messrs. Hopkinson and Son of St. Albans Street, Knowles's agents, and Sharp wondered, as he walked towards the address Hogan had given him, just what a 4% stock was. The Lisbon office had laughed politely when he told them it was stolen. He had not given them all the coins. The house looked rich, and he imagined Hardy using the big front door that was answered by Agostino, Josefina's servant, who now wore a fancy powdered wig and a coat that was all buttons and lace. "Sir?" Sharp pushed him out of the way, strode into a marble hall with palms, rugs, and lattice screens. He thought of Teresa, pushed the thought away because he wanted her, and thought how she would have despised the scent that filled the hallway. He went into a huge room that opened through archways onto a terrace high above the Tagus. Orange trees framed the view, their scent mingling with the smell of perfume. "Josefina!" "Richard!" She was in an archway, the evening light round her body so he couldn't see her face. "What are you doing?" "Visiting you." She came forward, plumper than he remembered, and smiled at him. She touched his face with a finger, looked his uniform up and down, and made a face of disapproval. "You can't stay." "Why not?" She gestured outside. "He was first." He looked at her, remembering her differently, and he would have left if Patrick Harper had not already claimed the dark-haired maid at the American Hotel. Instead, he walked onto the terrace where a languid cavalry lieutenant sat with a glass of wine. The lieutenant looked up. "Sir?" "How much did you pay?" "Richard!" She was behind him, pulling at him. Sharp laughed. "Lieutenant?" "Damn you, sir!" The lieutenant stood up, the wine quivering in the glass. "How much did you pay?" "Damn your eye, sir, I'll call you out." Josefina was laughing now, enjoying herself. Sharp smiled. "You can. The name's Sharp. In the meantime, get out." "Sharp?" The lieutenant's expression had fallen. "Out!" But, sir," Sharp drew the sword, the great steel sword. "Out!" "Madame?" The lieutenant bowed to Josefina, put down his wine, glanced once at Sharp, and was gone. She hit him lightly. "You shouldn't have done that." "Why not?" He pushed the sword back into the scabbard. She pouted. "You was rich and generous." He laughed, opened his new ammunition pouch, the black leather still stiff, and threw the thick gold coins onto the patterned tiles. "Richard, what is it?" "Gold, you fool!" The convoy could take another month for all he cared. He tossed more coins, thick as butter. "Josefina's gold! Your gold! Our gold! My gold!" He laughed again, pulled her towards him. "Sharp's gold!"